They say blood is thicker than water. But when I opened that email from my mother, I learned that for my family, money was thicker than both. Subject line, family decision. No greeting. No explanation. Just 5 cold words that shattered everything I thought I knew about my place in this world. You are uninvited to the wedding. My sister Lila's wedding. The one I'd already bought a dress for. The one where I was supposed to be maid of honor. Gone. Erased. Like I never mattered at all. But here's the thing that made my blood run cold. Attached to that same email was an itemized spreadsheet. $60,000 in wedding expenses. Venue. Catering for 200 guests. 7-day family honeymoon to Turks and Caicos. And at the bottom, highlighted in yellow, Cassandra's contribution due within 14 days. My mother's note was the final knife. You should be grateful we're allowing you to participate financially, even though you can't attend. Family is about sacrifice. Banned from the wedding. Billed for the party. Expected to smile and pay for my own humiliation. Most people would have cried. Some would have paid just to keep the peace. A few might have cut them off forever. But me, I transferred exactly $1 with a memo that would start a war. First installment. Remaining balance pending contract review. Because what my family didn't know was this: I'd just inherited something from my grandmother. And it wasn't just money. It was justice. If you want to see how I turned their perfect wedding into the reckoning they never saw coming, you need to hear what happened next. My name is Cassandra Lowe. I'm 37 years old, a senior financial analyst at a mid-sized investment firm in downtown Seattle. And for most of my life, I've been really good at reading between the lines of numbers that don't add up. What I never learned until it was far too late was how to read the lies hidden in my own family. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing quarterly reports in my corner office. My phone buzzed with the notification, and I glanced at the screen expecting another meeting request or client update. Instead, I saw my mother's name in my inbox with a subject line that made my stomach drop: family decision. Please respect our wishes. I should have known right then. Should have felt the knife before it even broke the skin. But I opened it anyway, and that's when my carefully constructed understanding of who I was to these people began to crumble. Dear Cassandra, it began as if she were writing to a distant acquaintance rather than her eldest daughter. After much consideration and discussion with your father and Lila, we have decided that it would be best for everyone if you do not attend Lila's wedding on June 15th. We believe the family needs a peaceful atmosphere without any underlying tension, and we think this arrangement will allow everyone to enjoy the day fully. We hope you understand and will respect our wishes during this special time. With love, Mom. I read it twice. Then a third time, searching for the sentence, I must have missed the one that explained what tension she was talking about, what I had done to deserve this clinical dismissal from my own sister's wedding. There was no explanation, no phone call preceding this, no conversation where I might have defended myself against accusations I didn't even know existed. It was a termination notice. That's what it felt like. The kind of impersonal corporate speak message you'd send to cancel a subscription service you no longer needed. Dear valued customer, we regret to inform you that your membership in this family has been discontinued effective immediately. My hands didn't shake. I noticed that about myself in that moment, a strange, detached observation. My hands were perfectly steady as I scrolled down to see if there was anything else, any other humiliation my mother had decided to attach to this gut punch of an email. And oh, there was. Below her signature sat an Excel spreadsheet attachment titled Wedding Expenses, Final Budget. I clicked it open, and rows upon rows of itemized costs filled my screen in neat, color-coded cells. Venue rental at the Fairmont Garden Estate, $18,000. Catering for 200 guests with premium bar service, $22,000. Photography and videography package, $8,000. Floral arrangements and decor, $5,000. 7-day family honeymoon trip to Turks and Caicos, including airfare and resort accommodations for Mom, Dad, Lila, and her fiancé, Cole, $15,000. Miscellaneous coordination fees, cake invitations, wedding favors, valet parking, $2,000. The total at the bottom highlighted in cheerful yellow as if it were good news, $60,000. And beneath that, in a separate box with a red border for emphasis, Cassandra's contribution due $60,000. Payment expected within 14 days via wire transfer to account ending in 4782. I stared at that number. $60,000. Not a request to chip in. Not an invitation to contribute what I could afford. The entire bill, every single expense itemized down to the cocktail napkins and valet services handed to me like an invoice for services I would never receive. But it was the note at the very bottom that made something inside me go cold and sharp. My mother had added one final line in italics, the digital equivalent of a whisper meant to cut, "You should be grateful we're allowing you to participate financially even though you can't attend. Family is about sacrifice, Cassandra. We hope you'll do the right thing." Grateful. She wanted me to be grateful. I sat there in my office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay, surrounded by the trappings of a successful career I'd built entirely on my own, and I felt the weight of 37 years of being the family's ATM finally settle onto my shoulders. This wasn't new. This was just the most audacious version of a pattern I'd been too loyal, too hopeful, too stupidly optimistic to name. But here's the thing about being a financial analyst. I'm very good at recognizing when the numbers don't tell the whole story. And these numbers were screaming something my mother didn't intend for me to hear. I didn't call her, didn't text my father or my sister demanding an explanation, didn't send a furious reply email that they could screenshot and use as evidence that I was in fact the source of all that mysterious tension they wanted to avoid. Instead, I opened my banking app and initiated a wire transfer to the account ending in 4782. I typed in the amount carefully, $1.00. In the memo field, I wrote, "First installment, remaining balance pending contract review." Then I smiled. Not a happy smile, but the kind of smile you make when you finally stop pretending things are other than what they are, and I clicked send. Next, I created a new folder on my desktop. I labeled it Project Justice, and spent the next hour systematically screenshotting every email my mother had sent me in the past 6 months, every text message from family group chats, every Venmo request and payment confirmation, every digital breadcrumb of our financial entanglement. I worked methodically, my financial training kicking in as I organized documents by date and category, building a timeline I didn't yet fully understand but knew I would need. When that was done, I picked up my office phone and called my bank's customer service line. The representative answered with the usual cheerful greeting, and I cut straight through the pleasantries. "I need to review all accounts where I'm listed as an authorized user or co-owner." I said, my voice calm and professional, the same tone I used when auditing client portfolios. Every single one. And I need a full transaction history for the past 12 months sent to my email within the hour. "Of course, Ms. Lowe," the representative replied. "May I ask if there's a specific concern we should be aware of?" I looked at that email still open on my screen, the cold dismissal, the itemized extortion, the smug assumption that I would simply comply and pay, and be grateful for the privilege of financing my own exclusion. "Let's just say I'm conducting an audit," I said. By the time I hung up that call 45 minutes later, I'd discovered the first lie. A credit card I didn't know was still active. Charges I'd never authorized. Purchases made in my name for a wedding I was no longer invited to attend. And that discovery was going to cost my family far more than $60,000. It was going to cost them everything they'd built their little fantasy on: my silence, my compliance, and my willingness to keep pretending we were something we'd never actually been. A family. The thing about being the eldest daughter in a family like mine is that you learn very early to make yourself useful. Not loved useful. There's a difference, though. It took me 30 years to understand it. I was the trial-run daughter, the one my parents practiced on. From the moment I could hold a pencil, I was enrolled in advanced programs, music lessons, competitive sports. My mother loved telling her book club friends about my academic awards. My father enjoyed the reflected glory when I won the regional science fair at 12 or brought home straight-A report cards, semester after semester. I wasn't a child to them so much as a walking resume they could display at dinner parties. Then Lila was born when I was 7, and the entire ecosystem of our family shifted overnight. Suddenly, my achievements became expectations rather than celebrations. When I won the state science competition at 14, a genuinely prestigious honor that came with a scholarship and a feature in the local newspaper, my parents took me out for dinner to celebrate. I remember sitting at that table waiting for them to ask me about my project on sustainable water filtration systems, waiting for some acknowledgement of the hundreds of hours I'd spent in our garage building prototypes. Instead, my mother spent the entire meal talking about 5-year-old Lila's ballet recital from the previous weekend. How adorable she looked in her pink tutu. How the instructor said she had natural grace. And how she'd forgotten her steps halfway through but improvised with such confidence that the audience laughed and applauded anyway. "That's the difference between you two," my mother said, reaching across the table to pat my hand as if delivering a compliment. "You're so focused and driven, Cassandra. But Lila, she's got that spark, that spontaneity. She knows how to enjoy life instead of always working so hard." I was too serious, you see, too intense, not fun enough. While Lila was praised for being free-spirited and creative, I was the dependable one, the responsible one, the one who didn't need as much attention, because I already had everything figured out. The pattern calcified over the years, until it became the architecture of our entire family dynamic. I achieved things, and Lila was celebrated for simply being herself. I graduated summa cum laude from the University of Washington with a degree in finance, funding my entire education through a combination of academic scholarships and grueling part-time work at a tax preparation office. My parents came to my graduation, took photos, and left early because Lila had an art show opening at her high school that same evening. The following year, they paid $35,000 for Lila's exploratory gap year, backpacking through Europe, because she needed to find herself before committing to college. When I suggested that perhaps Lila could work part-time and save some of her own money for the trip, my mother looked at me as if I'd proposed something cruel and unusual. "Not everyone is built like you, Cassandra," she said. "Lila needs different things. She's more sensitive, more artistic. We can't expect her to just grind through life the way you do." So I learned to stop expecting anything at all. I built my career, bought my own condo, created a life that didn't require their approval or their financial support. I went to therapy, lots of it, where a patient woman named Dr. Reeves helped me understand that I couldn't change my family, only manage my relationship with them. She taught me about boundaries, about accepting people for who they are, rather than who you need them to be, about distinguishing between connection and enmeshment. I thought I'd done the work. I thought I'd reached a place of detached acceptance where I could show up for holidays with thoughtful gifts and polite conversation, maintain just enough contact to be considered a good daughter without giving them the power to hurt me anymore. But then 4 months before that email arrived, my parents called a family financial planning meeting. They made it sound responsible, mature. My father said they were updating their estate documents and wanted to make sure everyone was on the same page about beneficiaries, medical directives, power of attorney designations. It seemed reasonable. I was exhausted from a 60-hour work week, irritable from too much coffee and too little sleep, but I drove to their house on a Sunday afternoon because this was the kind of thing good daughters do. They sat me down at the dining room table with a stack of papers 2 inches thick. Insurance forms, will amendments, healthcare proxy authorizations. My father slid them across the table and pointed to little yellow sticky tabs marking where I needed to sign. "Just standard stuff," he said. "Sign where it's highlighted. We had the lawyer look everything over." I should have read every page. That's what I do for a living. I read financial documents, I find the discrepancies, I catch the fine print that doesn't match the verbal promises. But these were my parents. I trusted them in the specific, limited way you trust people who raised you, even when you know better. So I signed where the yellow tabs indicated, initialing here and there, scrawling my signature across signature lines, while my mother offered me coffee and asked about my job. Hidden somewhere in that stack, buried between the legitimate legal documents, was something they called a family contribution agreement. I never saw it clearly. Never read the clause that said the eldest child agrees to financially support family celebrations proportional to income and family standing. The signature on that document looks enough like mine that any casual observer would accept it, but I have no memory of signing anything with that title or that language. This wasn't an oversight on their part. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was premeditated entrapment planned months in advance, designed to give them legal cover for what they were about to demand from me. And I'd walked right into it, too tired and too trusting to see the trap until it had already closed around my throat. I wasn't weak for staying in contact with them all these years. I was strategic, careful, trying to salvage whatever scraps of family connection might still be worth preserving. But this being banned from my sister's wedding and then billed for the privilege of my own exclusion, this was different. This was the line I didn't even know existed until they crossed it. The old Cassandra would have paid the $60,000 just to make the problem go away, to keep the fragile peace, to prove she wasn't the cold, difficult person they'd always implied she was. But the new Cassandra, the one who'd just discovered fraudulent charges on a credit card she didn't know was active, she opened a new spreadsheet and started documenting everything with the precision of someone who'd finally stopped trying to be loved and started demanding to be respected. That night my phone lit up with 47 text messages from the family group chat. Every single one asked the same thing in slightly different words. "When are you going to pay Cassandra?" I ignored those 47 text messages. Let them sit there unanswered, a small act of defiance that felt larger than it probably was. For 3 days, my phone continued buzzing with variations on the same demand, the same assumption that I would eventually cave and comply because that's what I'd always done. But I was busy with something more important than responding to their financial harassment. I was following the money. On Thursday afternoon, 3 days after I'd sent that $1 transfer with its pointed memo, a certified letter arrived at my condo. The mail carrier handed it to me personally, requiring my signature on his tablet. The return address made my stomach clench: Delacroix Bridal Boutique, one of those upscale wedding dress shops in downtown Bellevue where they serve champagne while brides try on gowns that cost more than some people's cars. I opened the envelope standing right there in my building's lobby, and what I found inside was a billing statement printed on heavy cream-colored cardstock with elegant script across the top. Final payment due, Lila Lowe Wedding Dress Collection. The amount at the bottom highlighted and bolded $8,200. But that wasn't the detail that made the floor seem to tilt beneath my feet. It was the account name listed under primary cardholder Cassandra Marie Lowe, and the purchase date 3 months ago, shortly after Lila's engagement party. My hands went numb. I read it again, certain I was misunderstanding something, but the words didn't change. According to this invoice, I had purchased my sister's wedding dress. I had somehow walked into a bridal boutique, selected an $8,000 gown, and charged it to an account I didn't remember having. I pulled out my phone and called the boutique, immediately, still standing in my lobby with the letter trembling in my hand. A woman answered with the kind of practiced elegance that comes from years of dealing with wealthy clients. Delacroix Bridal, this is Miranda speaking. How may I help you create your perfect day? This is Cassandra Lowe. I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I just received a billing statement for a wedding dress I never purchased. There was a pause, the sound of typing. Oh yes, Ms. Lowe. I have your account right here. Is there a problem with the final payment processing? There's a problem with all of it, I said. I never bought a wedding dress. I've never even been to your store. More typing, then a tone of cheerful confusion. That's strange. Your mother came in with your credit card back in March. Lovely woman. She and your sister spent about 3 hours with us. We have the signed receipt right here. My mother came in with my credit card. The words echoed in my head like a gunshot in an empty room. What credit card? I asked, though some part of me was already beginning to understand. Let me see. It's a Visa ending in 7739. The name on the card is yours, and we verified ID at the time of purchase per our store policy. Visa ending in 7739. A number I hadn't thought about in 15 years. The credit card my parents had opened for me when I turned 18, telling me it was important for building credit history that I should keep it active but didn't need to use it. They'd offered to manage the account for me to make sure it stayed in good standing while I focused on school. I'd agreed because I was 18 and didn't know any better, and then I'd simply forgotten about it as I built my own financial life with my own cards, my own accounts, my own carefully constructed independence. I thanked Miranda and ended the call, then immediately pulled up my banking app with shaking hands. It took me several minutes of searching through old linked accounts before I found it buried in a list of cards I'd stopped monitoring years ago. The Visa, ending in 7739, showing a current balance that made my vision blur. $43,000. I logged into the full account online, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, and watched as 3 months of transaction history loaded onto my screen. Wedding venue deposit, $11,000 charged 8 days after Lila's engagement party. Catering down payment, $9,000. Photographer retainer, $4,500. Florist consultation and deposit, $3,200. The wedding dress, $8,200. On and on it went, every single vendor for Lila's wedding appearing in neat chronological rows, charged to an account I'd abandoned years ago, an account that was still legally mine, but that I'd stopped receiving statements for because those statements went to my parents' address, listed as the secondary contact for billing convenience. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding or a family emergency where they borrowed my credit with intentions to pay it back. This was systematic fraud planned and executed over months, every charge carefully timed and documented. They hadn't asked me to pay for the wedding. They'd already spent my credit racked up debt in my name, destroyed my credit score with a balance I knew nothing about, and then sent me that $60,000 invoice as if they were doing me a favor by letting me contribute. The email from my mother, the one uninviting me from the wedding, had arrived on a Tuesday. I pulled up my calendar and cross-referenced it with the credit card timeline. The first charge on that card, the venue deposit, appeared exactly 1 week after Lila's engagement party. The party I had attended. The party where I'd stood up during the toasts and talked about how happy I was for my little sister, how she deserved all the joy in the world, how I couldn't wait to watch her start this new chapter. While I was celebrating her happiness, my parents were already planning how to use me. They knew even then that they would eventually exclude me from the actual wedding. They'd probably already decided it. But they needed my credit first. Needed to lock in the vendors, secure the venue, set everything in motion before I could ask questions, or set boundaries, or do anything to protect myself. The $60,000 invoice wasn't a request. It was a cover-up. They were trying to make it look like a family contribution, a voluntary gesture of sisterly love, when in reality they were just trying to hide the fact that they'd already committed identity theft and fraud. I didn't cry. I was past crying. Instead, I spent the next 2 hours methodically screenshotting every transaction, exporting the complete statement history to a PDF, and documenting every detail in the spreadsheet I'd started after receiving that first email. Then I searched for financial fraud attorneys in Seattle and booked a consultation for the following Tuesday with a firm that specialized in family financial abuse cases. Finally, I opened the family group chat that had been blowing up my phone for 3 days and typed a single message: I need all vendor contracts and receipts sent to my email by Friday at 5 p.m. for tax purposes. I didn't explain, didn't accuse, just set a deadline and waited. Friday came and went. My inbox remained empty except for increasingly agitated texts from my mother asking why I needed contracts, what tax purposes I was referring to, whether I was trying to cause problems during Lila's special time. But Saturday morning, I woke up to an email from an address I didn't recognize. No name, just a string of numbers and letters that could have been anyone. The subject line made my blood run cold. You should see what your father actually signed. I opened the anonymous email with my hands hovering over the keyboard, half afraid of what I'd find and half desperate to know. The message itself contained no text, just 3 PDF attachments labeled simply Contract 1, Contract 2, and Contract 3. I downloaded them to a secure folder and opened the first file. What I saw made the fraudulent credit card charges look almost amateur by comparison. These were scanned copies of vendor contracts, but they'd been heavily redacted with a thick black marker, the kind of redaction you see in government documents or legal discovery. But whoever had done the redacting had missed things, or perhaps intentionally left certain details visible. In the margins, I could see handwritten notes in what looked like my father's cramped writing: donor rebate 15%, church waiver applied, community discount verified. I scrolled through page after page, my eyes scanning for anything that made sense, and then I found it. Buried in the third contract, a line item that made my breath catch: Sacred Heart Chapel blessing fee and administrative services, $5,000. Sacred Heart. The name hit me like a physical blow. That was Grandma May's church, the small Catholic chapel on the north side of town where she'd worshipped every Sunday for 40 years before she passed away 8 years ago. May had loved that church had volunteered there, donated to their meal programs, spent countless hours organizing fundraisers for their community outreach. The chapel coordinator was Pastor Ruth Callahan, a warm woman in her 60s who'd been May's close friend and had delivered a beautiful eulogy at her funeral. I knew Sacred Heart didn't charge fees for weddings. May had told me that explicitly years ago when I'd asked about church policies. They accepted donations certainly, but they never required payment for sacramental services. It was part of their mission, part of what made them different from some of the more commercial wedding venues disguised as chapels. I picked up my phone and dialed the church office, forcing my voice to stay casual and light, even as my pulse hammered in my ears. Sacred Heart Chapel, this is Pastor Ruth speaking. Hi, Pastor Ruth, it's Cassandra Lowe, May's granddaughter. Cassandra. Her voice warmed immediately. Oh, sweetheart, it's been too long. How are you? I'm well, thank you. Listen, I have a quick question about my sister Lila's wedding. Mom mentioned something about a chapel fee, and I just wanted to confirm the amount. She said $5,000. The silence that followed was so complete, I thought the call had dropped. Then Pastor Ruth's voice came back careful and confused. Cassandra, sweetheart, we don't charge fees for weddings. We never have. What are you talking about? My suspicions crystallized into certainty. Pastor Ruth, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. In the past 5 years, have my parents made any charitable donations to Sacred Heart? Any amount, any purpose? Another pause, this one filled with the sound of papers rustling. Let me check our records. Hold on. I waited, counting my own heartbeats while she presumably pulled up the church's donation database. When she came back, her voice had shifted into something more guarded. Cassandra, according to our records, your parents haven't made a donation to Sacred Heart since your grandmother's funeral reception, which we hosted at no charge. Why do you ask? Because they'd been claiming $30,000 in charitable donations to your church on their tax returns over the past 5 years, I thought, but didn't say. Because they were using May's beloved church as a cover for tax fraud. I'll explain everything soon, I said. But Ruth, I need to know one more thing. After May passed away, did my parents ever donate to the senior meal program in her memory? No, honey, we never received anything like that. I would have remembered, and I would have made sure to acknowledge it properly. Your grandmother loved that program. I closed my eyes, feeling something crack open inside my chest. 3 years ago, right after May's funeral, I'd seen the announcement in the church bulletin. A notice thanking the Lowe family for their generous $15,000 donation to the senior meal program in loving memory of May Lowe. I'd felt a complicated mix of emotions seeing that, surprised that my parents had been so generous, guilty that I hadn't thought to make a similar gesture myself. It had never happened. They'd fabricated the donation, claimed the tax deduction, and pocketed the refund while May's name was used to legitimize their theft. They'd stolen from my grandmother's legacy, turned her death into a tax shelter, and let the church community believe in a generosity that never existed. "Ruth," I said, my voice shaking now despite my best efforts. "I need to see you in person, today if possible. There's something you need to know about my family, and it involves the church." She agreed immediately, hearing the urgency in my tone, and we set a time for that afternoon. When I arrived at Sacred Heart, the chapel was empty and quiet, afternoon sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows May had helped fundraise to restore 20 years ago. Ruth met me in her small office behind the sanctuary, and I spent 40 minutes laying out everything I'd discovered, showing her the fraudulent contracts, the credit card statements, the tax documents my fraud attorney had helped me obtain through preliminary discovery requests. Ruth listened with her hands folded on her desk, her expression moving from shock to sadness to something that looked almost like resignation, as if she'd suspected something was wrong but hadn't wanted to believe it. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and looked at me with eyes that held both grief and determination. "Your grandmother knew this might happen," she said quietly. "That's why she left you something." She stood and moved to an old filing cabinet in the corner, unlocking it with a key she wore on a chain around her neck. From the bottom drawer, she pulled out a large manila envelope, its edges worn with age, sealed with red wax that bore May's initials. Across the front, in May's distinctive handwriting, "For Cassandra only, to be opened when family causes public harm." Ruth handed it to me, and I broke the seal with trembling fingers. Inside were legal documents, official and notarized, establishing something called the May Low Community Justice Fund. As I skimmed the pages, I saw numbers that made my vision blur: a trust account containing $180,000 managed by Ruth as trustee, designated for purposes I'd need to read more carefully to fully understand. But it was the USB drive taped to the inside of the envelope that Ruth reached for, carefully peeling it free and holding it up to the light. "She recorded this the month before she died," Ruth said softly. "She made me promise to show it to you only if you came to me with evidence of what she feared most." Ruth plugged the drive into her laptop and turned the screen toward me. After a moment of loading, Grandma May's face filled the screen, filmed right here in this office 8 years ago. She looked frailer than I remembered, the cancer already taking its toll, but her eyes were sharp and clear and filled with a love so fierce it made my throat close up. "Cassandra, sweetheart," May's voice said from beyond the grave, and I had to grip the edge of Ruth's desk to steady myself. "If you're watching this, it means your mother did to you what she once did to me. I'm so sorry, baby. I tried to protect you, but I'm giving you the tools to set things right, not with cruelty, but with truth." As May's voice filled that small chapel office, Pastor Ruth leaned forward and whispered, "There's a clause in the trust you need to know about, and it changes everything." May's face on that screen looked older than I remembered, the illness already hollowing her cheeks and dimming the vibrance I'd always associated with her, but her eyes held a clarity that cut through the 8 years since her death, like she was sitting right there in the room with me. "Let me tell you a story, sweetheart," she continued, her voice measured and deliberate, the way she used to speak when she was teaching me something important. 35 years ago, when your mother was planning her wedding to your father, I offered to pay for half of everything as my gift to them. I was so proud, so happy to help my daughter start her new life. I wrote checks, I met with vendors, I did everything a mother does when she wants to give her child a beautiful beginning. May paused, and I saw her hands clench slightly in her lap, a gesture I recognized from my childhood whenever she was working through something painful. After the wedding, I was going through my bank statements, reconciling everything the way I always did, and I noticed the numbers didn't match what the vendors had quoted me. So I called them. One by one, I called every single vendor, and do you know what I discovered? May's voice didn't rise, but it hardened in a way that made my chest tighten. Every invoice your mother had shown me was inflated. The florist didn't charge $3,000, she charged $1,800. The photographer didn't cost $4,500, he cost $2,800. The reception venue gave us a discount because I was a regular donor to their associated charity, but your mother never mentioned that discount. She showed me the full price invoices. I paid half of those amounts, and she pocketed the difference. Nearly $9,000, Cassandra. She stole $9,000 from me while I thought I was generously funding her dream wedding. I felt like I'd been punched. My mother had done this before. This wasn't a new pattern, wasn't something that evolved over time or emerged from desperation. This was who she'd always been, and May had known it. I confronted her, May said, and now her voice did crack slightly. I sat her down, showed her the evidence, asked her to explain. And do you know what she did? She cried. She said I was calling her a liar, that I was ruining her marriage before it even started, that I was a cruel, suspicious mother who couldn't just let her daughter be happy. Then she stopped speaking to me entirely. For a whole year, Cassandra. A whole year where I wasn't allowed to see you, wasn't allowed to be part of your life because I dared to point out that she'd stolen from me. I watched my grandmother's face on that screen and saw the pain there, the wound that had never fully healed. I broke first, May admitted. I apologized for upsetting her even though I'd done nothing wrong. I paid her another $2,000 as a belated wedding gift, even though I'd already been robbed. I did whatever it took to get access to you again because she knew exactly what weapon would work on me. You were 6 months old and I was missing your first year. So I paid emotionally and financially for the privilege of loving my granddaughter. May leaned closer to the camera, and I could see tears gathering in her eyes, even as her voice remained steady and strong. I learned something then that I should have learned earlier in life. I learned that some people see family not as a bond to honor, but as a resource to extract. They find your weakness the thing you love most, and they use it as leverage to get what they want. I forgave your mother because she's my daughter and I loved her despite everything. But I won't let her do it to you, Cassandra. You're stronger than I was. You're smarter than I was. And I'm giving you what I wish someone had given me, the tools to fight back with truth instead of just surrendering to keep the peace. The video paused as Ruth reached over and pressed a button, freezing May's face on the screen. Before we continue, Ruth said gently, I need to explain what your grandmother built for you. She pulled the trust documents closer and walked me through the legal framework with the patience of someone who'd done this before, who'd prepared for this exact moment. The May Low Community Justice Fund, established 8 years ago with $180,000 from May's estate, operated under something called a Community Harm Restoration Clause. Ruth explained that if family actions caused documented public harm, specifically fraud involving community institutions like Sacred Heart, or reputational damage to charitable causes, or financial abuse that affected public trust, then I could petition Ruth as trustee to use the funds for restorative activities. What does that mean exactly? I asked, struggling to process the legal language while my emotions were still raw from May's confession. It means you can't take this money and spend it on a vacation or a new car, Ruth said plainly. But you can use it to repair the damage your family has caused. You can hire professionals to investigate and document the fraud. You can host community events that restore the church's reputation after it's been used as a cover for their schemes. You can support the causes your grandmother cared about that have been harmed by your family's actions. It's not revenge money, Cassandra. It's justice infrastructure. I sat back in my chair trying to absorb what that meant. May hadn't just left me money. She'd left me a framework, a moral structure for holding my family accountable without becoming like them. Ruth pressed play again, and May's voice filled the small office once more. I'm leaving you money, yes, May said, looking directly into the camera, as if she could see me across time and death. But more importantly, I'm leaving you permission. Permission to stop setting yourself on fire to keep them warm. Permission to demand that they face consequences. Permission to build a life where your worth isn't measured by their approval or their need or their endless capacity to take from you. May's eyes filled with tears, but her voice never wavered, never broke. If your mother is watching this, somehow, I want her to know that I loved her. I loved her despite everything because that's what mothers do. But I loved truth more. And Cassandra, my beautiful, brilliant, strong granddaughter, you deserve the truth. You deserve to stop carrying the weight of their dysfunction. You deserve to be free. The screen went black. The only sound in the office was my own ragged breathing and the quiet hum of Ruth's old laptop. Tears streamed down my face, but I wasn't collapsing under their weight. I was sitting straighter, breathing deeper, feeling something inside me that had been twisted and compressed for 37 years finally begin to straighten out. Ruth handed me a tissue and slid the trust documents across her desk. "Your grandmother weaponized her estate for good," she said softly. "The question is, are you ready to use it?" I wiped my eyes, looked at those documents, looked at Ruth's kind, steady face, and felt May's presence in that room as clearly as if she were standing beside me. "I need to hire a forensic accountant and a private investigator," I said, my voice clear and certain. "Can the trust cover that?" Ruth smiled, and it was the kind of smile that held both sadness and pride. "Cassandra, that's exactly what your grandmother hoped you'd say." Within 48 hours of leaving Pastor Ruth's office, I had assembled what I privately started calling my justice team. The first person I hired was Martin Chen, a retired IRS forensic accountant in his late 60s who'd specialized in family financial fraud cases for 30 years before retiring to spend more time with his grandchildren. When Ruth mentioned his name, she'd smiled and said, "He was one of May's bridge partners. He loved your grandmother, and he hates people who steal from family." I met Martin at a coffee shop near his home in Kirkland, and within 10 minutes of reviewing the credit card statements, I'd brought his eyes lit up with the kind of enthusiasm I imagined detectives felt when handed a murder weapon with fingerprints still on it. He spread the documents across our table, pulling out a mechanical pencil and marking discrepancies with quick, precise strokes. "This isn't just sloppy," he muttered, circling a vendor charge that appeared twice with slightly different dates. "This is arrogant. They didn't even try to hide it because they assumed you'd never check. Look here, they're claiming the same photographer deposit on 2 different cards. And this catering invoice. The math doesn't even work. They've got 200 guests at $110 per plate, but the venue capacity maxes out at 120 according to the fire code." I watched him work, watched him get genuinely excited about exposing my family's fraud, and felt something loosen in my chest. I wasn't alone anymore. I wasn't the crazy daughter imagining slights or overreacting to simple misunderstandings. The numbers didn't lie, and Martin could read them like a language my family had assumed I'd never bother to learn. The second member of my team was Emily Torres, an attorney specializing in elder financial abuse and estate law. She came highly recommended by Martin, who'd worked with her on several cases involving adult children exploiting aging parents. Emily was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed and direct, in a way I appreciated immediately. When I laid out everything I'd discovered, the credit cards, the fake church donations, the forged family contribution agreement, she didn't gasp or express shock. She simply nodded and started taking notes. "Here's what we're not going to do," she said after I'd finished my summary. "We're not going to confront them yet. We're not going to threaten legal action or send angry emails or give them any warning that you're building a case. Right now, they think they've won. They think you're too embarrassed or too weak or too committed to keeping the peace to do anything about this. That assumption is our greatest asset." Her strategy was meticulous. Build an airtight case, first document. Everything establish a timeline of fraud that would be impossible to dispute, and only then decide whether to pursue criminal charges, civil litigation, or some other form of accountability. "By the time we're done," Emily said, "they won't have a single defense left. They'll have nothing but the truth, and the truth is going to bury them." Martin's investigation expanded rapidly once he had full access to my financial records and Ruth's church documentation. He discovered that the scheme went far beyond wedding expenses. Using my co-signed credit history from that ancient card I'd forgotten about my parents, had opened 2 additional store credit cards in the past year. One was with a high-end furniture retailer, $12,000 in charges for what Martin's research revealed was a complete furnishing of Lila's new apartment with her fiancé. The other was with a home improvement chain, $8,000 in renovations to my parents' house, including a new deck and updated kitchen appliances. None of it had been paid. All of it was destroying my credit score, a score I'd spent 15 years carefully building and maintaining. "They've been using you as a personal line of credit," Martin explained, showing me the credit report he'd pulled with my authorization. "Every missed payment, every maxed-out card, it's all hitting your file. Your score has dropped 130 points in the last 6 months." While Martin traced the money, I'd also hired a private investigator at Emily's recommendation. Sarah Kim was a former police detective who now ran her own investigation firm specializing in background checks and financial due diligence. I'd asked her to look into Cole Matthews, Lila's fiancé, because something about the way my parents had structured this entire scheme made me suspect he was more involved than just being an innocent groom. Sarah's preliminary report arrived via encrypted email 3 days later, and it raised more red flags than I'd anticipated. Cole had 3 limited liability companies registered in Delaware, a state notorious for allowing anonymous corporate structures that made tracking actual ownership nearly impossible. He had 2 prior bankruptcies, one from 7 years ago and another from 4 years ago, both dismissed, but leaving a trail of unpaid creditors and angry business partners. His Instagram feed showed a lifestyle of luxury travel, expensive watches, and high-end restaurants, but his tax returns, which Sarah had obtained through legal discovery channels, I didn't ask too many questions about, showed an annual income of only $30,000. "The math doesn't add up," Sarah noted in her report summary. "Either he's committing tax fraud by underreporting income, or he's funding his lifestyle through debt and scams. I'm leaning toward the latter based on the pattern of business partnerships that ended in lawsuits. This is someone who knows how to exploit trust and disappear before consequences catch up." For 2 weeks, I became a ghost to my family. The group chat continued to blow up with increasingly agitated messages demanding payment, asking why I was being difficult, accusing me of trying to ruin Lila's special day. My mother left voicemails that started out sweet and concerned. "Honey, we're just worried about you. Please call us back," and gradually devolved into barely concealed threats about family loyalty and consequences. My father sent formal emails with subject lines like, "Final notice payment required," as if he were a collections agency rather than my parent. I didn't respond to any of it. I just collected every piece of communication, every text message, every voicemail. Emily had given me software that recovered deleted texts from my cloud backup, and I discovered months of group chat messages I'd missed, or that had been sent while I was muted messages, where my mother complained about my attitude, and my father calculated how much money they could extract from me for various family expenses. I created a spreadsheet color-coded according to Emily's specifications. Green for provable fraud with documentary evidence, yellow for suspicious activity that needed more investigation, red for potential criminal charges with sufficient evidence to refer to prosecutors. I worked on it every night after my regular job, updating it as Martin and Sarah fed me new information, cross-referencing credit card charges with family events and vendor invoices with actual costs. By the end of the 2nd week, I had 47 line items in that spreadsheet. 29 of them were coded red. Then at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, my phone rang. Sarah Kim's name appeared on the screen, and I answered immediately because she knew not to call this late unless it was urgent. "You need to see this," she said without preamble. "Cole isn't just broke. He's running a wedding vendor scam, and your sister's wedding is the centerpiece." Sarah emailed me her full report within 20 minutes of that late-night call, and I spent the next hour staring at my laptop screen with a growing sense of horror that had nothing to do with my own victimization and everything to do with my sister's. The report opened with a detailed analysis of Cole's social media presence, specifically an Instagram account he'd created 2 months before the wedding called Destination Dreams Wedding. Sarah had included screenshots of every post, and as I scrolled through them, I felt my stomach turn. The account featured glossy professional photographs of what was supposedly Lila's upcoming wedding, a model in an $8,000 Vera Wang gown, the exact dress listed on my fraudulent credit card statement, posed at the Fairmont Garden Estate venue where Lila's ceremony was supposedly booked. The captions were carefully crafted influencer speak. When your vision meets at Venue Garden's excellence, #sponsored dream, #luxury wedding, #PNW bride. The comments sections were filled with vendor accounts offering partnership opportunities, asking about collaboration rates, tagging their own businesses in hopes of being featured. Sarah's analysis explained the con in clinical detail. Cole had positioned this wedding as an influencer event, claiming the account had organic reach to 50,000 followers interested in luxury Pacific Northwest weddings. He'd approached vendors with a pitch provide services at cost, or even for free in exchange for prominent featured placement on the Instagram account and associated blog posts. The vendors, desperate for exposure in a competitive market, had agreed to massive discounts. Some had waived fees entirely. Cole then turned around and showed my parents inflated invoices at full retail price, charged those amounts to my credit card, paid the vendors their actual discounted rate, and planned to pocket the substantial difference. But it was the next section of Sarah's report that made me feel physically sick. The woman in those Instagram photos wasn't Lila. Sarah had run every image through reverse image search and facial recognition software. The model's name was Mia Chen, a professional bridal model based in Portland, who rented herself out for vendor portfolio shoots at $500 for a 4-hour session. Sarah had found Mia's own Instagram account, where the same photos appeared with different captions tagged as portfolio work and vendor collaboration. Mia had posed in that Vera Wang gown at that venue for what she thought was a legitimate promotional shoot for the dress designer. She had no idea her images were being used to perpetrate fraud. The real dress Lila would wear on her wedding day, Sarah had tracked down the actual order, a $1,200 knockoff purchased from an online retailer that specialized in designer replicas. It was close enough to the Vera Wang in photographs that casual observers might not notice the difference, but anyone who looked closely would see the cheaper fabric, the less precise tailoring, the subtle ways it fell short of the original. Sarah's report detailed even more disturbing discrepancies. The catering invoice my parents had charged to my card claimed service for 200 guests at $110 per plate, totaling $22,000. But Sarah had obtained the actual venue booking through connections I didn't ask about, and the reservation was for 50 people maximum. Cole had fabricated invoices for 150 ghost guests who would never exist, charged my credit for the inflated amount arranged to pay the caterer for the actual 50-person count at the discounted rate he'd negotiated, and planned to pocket the $18,000 difference. It wasn't just the dress and the catering. Every single vendor had been scammed in the same way. The photographer thought he was shooting an influencer wedding for portfolio credit and was charging a third of his normal rate. The florist had waived her design fee entirely for the exposure. The DJ was working for cost of equipment only. Cole had created a complete fabrication, a wedding that existed in 2 different versions, one real and modest, and one fictional and extravagant, and he was using the gap between those 2 realities to fund what was essentially a money laundering operation disguised as a celebration. But the worst part? The detail that made me want to cry for my sister, even as I was still angry at my parents, was buried in the surveillance footage Sarah had obtained. She'd gotten security camera recordings from the bridal boutique through a subpoena related to the credit card fraud case, and the footage showed Lila trying on dresses with genuine excitement and joy. The timestamps showed she'd visited 3 times, spending hours searching for the perfect gown, believing my parents were paying for it, believing this was a normal wedding planning experience. In one clip, Lila asked the boutique consultant about the budget, and the consultant, clearly coached by Cole, responded with reassuring vagueness about family arrangements and everything being handled. Cole had never let Lila see a single invoice. When she asked questions about costs, he deflected with phrases like, "Don't worry, babe, I've got connections," and "Everything's handled, just focus on enjoying your day." Sarah's report included text message exchanges between Cole and Lila that she'd recovered through legal discovery, and in every single one where Lila expressed concern about expenses, Cole soothed her with lies about vendor friendships and industry discounts and family generosity. My sister wasn't the villain in this story. She wasn't even a willing participant. She was a prop, a beautiful face being used to legitimize a scam she didn't understand and hadn't consented to. Cole was using her the same way he was using me, the same way he was using my parents' desperate need for social status, and their assumption that I'd be too compliant to fight back. The wedding wasn't about love or commitment or building a life together. It was a short-term con designed to extract maximum money from maximum sources before Cole disappeared, probably after a brief marriage he'd annul, claiming incompatibility, leaving Lila heartbroken and my family financially devastated. I sat back from my laptop, my mind racing through the implications. Cole was the architect. My parents were accomplices, either knowing or willfully ignorant, too invested in the fantasy to ask hard questions. And Lila was the unwitting centerpiece of a fraud that would destroy her emotionally even if she escaped financial liability. I had two choices. I could expose Cole, immediately burn down the entire con with all the evidence Sarah had gathered, watch him face criminal charges and social humiliation. But that path would also humiliate Lila publicly, would make her the subject of pitying gossip and cruel speculation about how she could have been so blind. Or I could find a way to save my sister while still ensuring Cole faced consequences for what he'd done. I was still trying to figure out which path to take when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was short and urgent. "This is Vanessa Park, the wedding planner. We need to talk, tonight." I texted back immediately, and Vanessa Park responded with an address, a 24-hour diner in Renton, far enough from both our neighborhoods to be anonymous. I grabbed my laptop bag, threw on a jacket, and drove through empty streets with my mind spinning through possibilities. Wedding planners didn't typically reach out to family members at 11 at night unless something had gone very, very wrong. When I walked into the diner, I spotted Vanessa immediately. She was sitting in a corner booth, hands wrapped around a coffee cup, looking like she hadn't slept in days. She was in her 50s, well-dressed, even at this hour, in a way that spoke to professional standards, but her eyes were shadowed with exhaustion and something that looked like guilt. "Cassandra," she asked as I approached, and I nodded. She gestured to the seat across from her, and I slid into the booth. A waitress appeared, poured me coffee I didn't ask for, and disappeared back into the fluorescent-lit kitchen. "I've been in this industry for 20 years, Vanessa began without preamble, her hands shaking slightly around her cup. "I've planned over 300 weddings. I've dealt with difficult clients, family drama, budget issues, every kind of chaos you can imagine. But I've never seen anything like this, and I can't stay silent anymore." She took a breath, steadying herself, and I waited, letting her gather whatever courage had brought her here at midnight. 6 months ago, Cole Matthews approached me with what he called a unique opportunity. He said his fiancée came from a complicated family situation where the older sister was wealthy and wanted to fund the wedding, but preferred to stay in the background. He said you were reclusive, didn't like attention, and wanted to contribute anonymously without being involved in the planning process. He made it sound almost touching, like you were this generous, secret benefactor who just wanted your sister to be happy. I felt my jaw tighten but kept my expression neutral. He told me all invoices needed to go through him first for approval before being forwarded to your parents, who were supposedly coordinating with you behind the scenes. That was my first red flag, but he had an explanation for everything. He said your parents didn't want to burden you with details, that they were acting as intermediaries to protect your privacy. Vanessa looked down at her coffee. "I should have questioned it more. But your mother confirmed everything when I asked her directly. She said you were shy about your generosity, that you'd specifically requested minimal involvement. So I believed it." She reached into the professional-looking tote bag beside her and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table. Inside was a contract addendum I'd never seen before, dated 4 months ago with my name typed across the top. "This is a donor override authorization." Vanessa explained, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, even though we were the only customers in this section of the diner. Cole insisted I add it to our standard contract. It states that if the primary family contributors your parents couldn't pay for any reason, I was authorized to bill you directly as the secondary family sponsor. And here's the part that should have made me refuse it, gave me the legal ability to add reasonable service adjustments up to 25% above the original quote. I read the clause carefully, my financial training kicking in to parse the legal language. What Vanessa was describing was essentially a blank check. If my parents stalled on payment or couldn't cover costs, Vanessa could inflate the bill by a quarter and send it directly to me, and according to this contract, it would be legally enforceable. "He told me you'd agreed to this," Vanessa said, and now tears were forming in her eyes. "He said you were just humble and didn't want recognition for your generosity. He showed me emails that looked like they came from you confirming these arrangements. And when I asked your mother about it, she backed up his story completely. She said Cassandra wants to help, she just doesn't want Lila to feel awkward about it." So I added the clause. My mother had lied to the wedding planner, had actively participated in creating a legal document that would make me liable for inflated wedding costs I'd never agreed to pay. Vanessa wasn't done. She pulled out her phone, opened her email app, and turned the screen toward me. But then Cole started asking for more. He sent me these. I scrolled through a series of emails where Cole requested that Vanessa create 2 different versions of every invoice. One showing the actual costs she'd negotiated with vendors, the discounted rates Cole had secured by falsely presenting the wedding as an influencer event, and another showing inflated costs that would be presented to my parents and charged to my credit. The difference between the 2 sets of numbers was staggering. "When I refused, he threatened me," Vanessa said quietly. "He said he'd leave devastating reviews on every platform, that he'd report me to the Better Business Bureau for breach of confidentiality, that he'd make sure no one in the Seattle wedding industry would work with me again. I've built this business over 2 decades. My reputation is everything. So, I compromised. I agreed to minor inflations, added some coordination fees I wouldn't normally charge, padded a few line items. But I drew the line at outright fraud." She took her phone back and pulled up another screen, her banking records. "But then last week I saw something that made me realize how deep this goes. I tried to process a payment on the credit card Cole gave me, the one he said was yours, and it was rejected. So I tried again. Rejected. I called the credit card company and they told me there were multiple fraud disputes filed on the account. That's when I understood. You didn't know. You'd never agreed to any of this." Vanessa reached back into her bag and pulled out a USB drive, setting it on the table between us. "This is everything. Every email Cole sent me, every version of every invoice, the real ones and the fake ones, every text message where he explicitly tells me how to manipulate the numbers. If I stay silent, I'm complicit in destroying your finances and your family. I can't live with that." I picked up the USB drive, feeling its weight in my palm, this tiny piece of plastic that contained evidence of systematic fraud. "Why now?" I asked. "Why tonight?" "Because tomorrow Cole is meeting with a travel agent to finalize the honeymoon arrangements," Vanessa said. "And he told me something that made me sick. He said if you cause any trouble, if you try to dispute the charges or refuse to pay, he has a backup plan." She leaned forward, her voice dropping even lower. "He's going to propose making you legally responsible for the honeymoon debt. He's already filed preliminary paperwork with a law firm claiming you verbally agreed to fund the entire trip as a wedding gift. He's got your mother ready to sign an affidavit supporting his claim, and once they get back from Turks and Caicos, he's going to hit you with a bill for $30,000 on top of everything else, and he thinks the contract I signed will help him enforce it." As I pocketed the USB drive processing this new layer of Cole's scheme, Vanessa grabbed my wrist across the table, her grip surprisingly strong. "There's something else," she whispered, glancing toward the diner's entrance, as if Cole himself might walk in. He's already filed preliminary paperwork to make you responsible for the honeymoon debt. And he told me he expects you to pay within 30 days of their return or he's taking you to court. The invitation arrived 2 days after my midnight meeting with Vanessa, landing in the family group chat with a tone of forced cheerfulness that made my skin crawl. Let's talk this out like adults. We're family. 7 p.m. Friday at the Metropolitan Grill. Cassandra, please come. We miss you. It was signed with a heart emoji from my mother, as if affection could be conveyed through a tiny digital icon after everything they'd done. Emily Torres called me within an hour of the invitation appearing on my phone. Don't go, she said flatly. This is a setup. They're going to try to pressure you in a public place where you'll feel obligated to be civil. Everything about this screams manipulation. But I saw something Emily didn't. I saw an opportunity to watch them play their hand to see what strategy they'd settled on now that weeks had passed without my compliance. I'm going, I told her, but I'm going prepared. Friday evening I dressed in my most severe business suit, the charcoal gray one I wore to contentious client meetings when I needed to project absolute authority. I pulled my hair back in a tight bun, applied minimal makeup, and carried my leather portfolio, the expensive one that signaled I meant business. Inside that portfolio was nothing but blank printer paper, but they didn't need to know that. The portfolio itself was a prop, a visual reminder that I was treating this like a business transaction rather than a family gathering. I arrived at the Metropolitan Grill exactly on time, not early enough to seem eager and not late enough to be considered rude. The hostess led me to a private corner table where my family was already seated, and the composition of the group made my stomach tighten. My parents sat on one side, my mother's face arranged in an expression of hopeful concern. Lila sat beside them, looking uncomfortable and avoiding my eyes. Cole sat at the head of the table like he was chairing a board meeting, and next to him, uninvited and unwelcome, sat a man in an expensive suit who Cole introduced as Jerry Branson, his business attorney. The presence of an attorney at what was supposed to be a family reconciliation dinner told me everything I needed to know about Cole's intentions. I took the only remaining seat directly across from Cole and ordered water when the server appeared. My mother tried to fill the awkward silence with small talk about the weather, about how nice the restaurant was, about how good it was that we were all together. I responded with polite monosyllables, and watched Cole watch the way he was calculating timing his move. It came halfway through the appetizers that I hadn't touched. Cole set down his fork with deliberate precision and leaned forward, his expression shifting into something he probably thought looked magnanimous. Cassandra, we really appreciate you coming tonight. We know there's been some confusion about the financial arrangements for the wedding, and we want to clear the air. His voice was smooth, practiced the tone of someone who'd rehearsed this speech. We've discussed it as a family, and we realize we may have communicated poorly about expectations. He reached into a folder beside his plate and pulled out a printed document, sliding it across the table to me. The header read, Family Financial Settlement Agreement, in bold letters. We want to make this right, Cole continued, and I could feel the attention of nearby tables turning toward us exactly as he'd intended. We're proposing a compromise. Instead of the full $60,000, we're asking for $15,000 immediately as a gesture of goodwill. You'd also agree to assume liability for any wedding cost overruns that might occur, which is standard for family sponsors in situations like this. In exchange, we want you to know that we value you. You'll be mentioned by name during the reception toast, and we'll make sure you have a place of honor in all the family wedding photos. The terms were laid out in neat bullet points, as if my compliance could be purchased with a 25% discount, and the promise of being mentioned during a party I was still banned from attending. Jerry the attorney leaned forward, adding his voice to the performance. This is a very fair compromise, Ms. Lowe. I've reviewed the documentation and I believe this settlement protects everyone's interests. Litigation would be costly for everyone involved emotionally and financially. This way we can keep everything in the family. The implied threat hung in the air. Agree to this, or we'll take you to court and make it public and expensive and ugly. The table went silent. My mother's face held that expression of expectant entitlement I'd seen my entire life, the look that said I was supposed to be grateful for the opportunity to give her what she wanted. My father wouldn't meet my eyes his discomfort with the whole situation manifesting as intense focus on his dinner roll. Lila looked miserable. Her hands twisted together in her lap, but she said nothing. And Cole watched me with barely concealed smugness, certain he'd backed me into a corner I couldn't escape from without causing a scene. I looked at each of their faces, really looked at them, and felt something inside me finally break free from the weight of 37 years of compliance. I stood up calmly, reaching into my portfolio and pulling out a single envelope I'd prepared before leaving my apartment. I placed it in the center of the table right on top of Cole's settlement agreement. "I don't negotiate with thieves," I said, my voice steady and clear, loud enough that the neighboring tables could definitely hear. I didn't care. I was done caring about appearances and propriety and keeping family dysfunction private. I turned directly to Lila, making eye contact with my sister for the first time since I'd arrived. "When you're ready to talk without his scripts, you know where to find me." Then I walked out. I didn't rush, didn't storm off in anger. I simply picked up my portfolio, nodded politely to our server, and left the restaurant while my family sat in stunned silence at that corner table. Inside the envelope I'd left behind was a single sheet of paper with one typed sentence: "I don't pay for love, I earn it, and you haven't earned anything." By the time I reached my car in the parking garage, my hands were shaking. But it wasn't fear or anxiety making them tremble. It was adrenaline, the physical aftermath of finally standing my ground and refusing to be bullied into funding my own humiliation. I was halfway home, stopped at a red light, when my phone started buzzing with incoming texts. I expected my mother's outrage, my father's disappointment, Cole's threats. But when I glanced at the screen, the name that appeared made my heart skip. Lila. 5 messages in rapid succession. "Can we meet alone? There's something about Cole I need to tell you. Please don't let him know. I think I've made a terrible mistake. Please, Cass, I need my sister." I met Lila the night after that dinner in a coffee shop on the opposite side of the city from where either of us lived, a place chosen specifically because no one in our family would accidentally walk in. She told me things about Cole that confirmed everything Sarah's investigation had revealed, showed me text messages where he'd lied about vendor costs, and instructed her never to ask questions about money. By the time we finished talking, my sister was crying, and I was holding her hand across the table, and something between us that had been broken for years started to feel like it might be repairable. But 3 days later, any hope of quiet resolution shattered completely. The process server arrived at my office on a Wednesday afternoon, handing me a thick manila envelope with the King County Superior Court seal embossed on the front. Inside was a formal legal complaint, professionally formatted and coldly impersonal, filed by Richard and Margaret Lowe, my parents, with representation by Gerald Branson, attorney at law. The header made my stomach drop. Complaint for breach of contract, emotional distress, and tortious interference. I sat at my desk and read through 16 pages of legal accusations that transformed my refusal to be defrauded into actionable offenses. The complaint claimed the family contribution agreement I'd supposedly signed at that meeting 4 months ago was a legally binding contract, that my refusal to honor its terms constituted breach of contract. It alleged that my public statements and accusations of fraud had caused my parents severe mental anguish, reputational harm in their community, and emotional distress requiring therapeutic intervention. It accused me of tortiously interfering with wedding planning by contacting vendors, making false allegations, and attempting to sabotage family celebrations. The damages sought were itemized with the same precision as that original $60,000 invoice: $60,000 in wedding costs, plus $40,000 in emotional damages, plus attorney fees and court costs. $100,000 total, give or take, for the crime of refusing to fund my own exclusion. I forwarded the complaint to Emily Torres, and she called me back within 20 minutes, her voice tight with controlled anger. "This is a slap suit," she said. "Strategic lawsuit against public participation. They're trying to silence you through legal intimidation. But here's what they didn't consider the moment they filed this: they opened themselves up to legal discovery. Everything they want to keep hidden. We can now subpoena it. Emily filed our response motion within 48 hours, and when she emailed me the draft for approval, I felt a grim satisfaction reading the header: Respondent's motion for financial transparency and fraud investigation regarding Sacred Heart Chapel Community Fund and related financial transactions. The motion didn't accuse my parents of specific crimes, not yet. Instead, it simply requested that the court compel full disclosure of all charitable donations claimed under Sacred Heart's name over the past 5 years, all vendor contracts associated with the wedding, and all credit accounts opened using my personal information or signature. "We're not playing defense," Emily explained when we spoke that evening. "We're turning their lawsuit into a public audit of everything they've been hiding. Let them explain to a judge why they claimed $30,000 in church donations that never arrived. Let them explain the forged signatures and the fraudulent credit cards." The motion was filed on a Friday morning, and by Friday afternoon, a reporter from the local newspaper had picked it up. The article ran online that evening under the headline, "Family Legal Battle Raises Questions About Charitable Donations." It was written as a human interest piece about the complications of family financial disputes, but it mentioned Sacred Heart by name, mentioned the discrepancy between claimed donations and received funds, and quoted an anonymous church official, probably Ruth, saying the matter was under internal review. By Sunday, the ripple effects had spread through our community like cracks in ice. I attended morning service at Sacred Heart, sitting in the back pew, where I could observe without being obvious. The church was more crowded than usual, filled with people who'd probably read the article and come out of curiosity or concern. I watched my parents arrive late and sit in their usual spot near the front, watched the way other parishioners glanced at them, and then quickly looked away. Watched my mother's spine grow stiffer with each whispered conversation she couldn't quite overhear. After the service, as people filed out into the spring sunshine, I heard fragments of conversations. "Did you see that article? I donated to that meal program I thought they had. $30,000, can you imagine?" The court of public opinion was convening, and my parents were discovering that legal intimidation worked both ways. My phone buzzed constantly throughout the week. Vendors I'd never heard of called asking if I was Cassandra Lowe and whether I could clarify payment arrangements because they'd been trying to reach my parents without success. Extended family members sent carefully worded text messages. "Saw something in the news, is everything okay?" And, "Is it true what they're saying about the church donations?" One cousin was more direct. "Did they really forge your signature? Because if they did, you should know you're not the only one." The Sacred Heart Board of Trustees requested a meeting with my parents to clarify donation records. I knew this because Pastor Ruth called me midweek, her voice weary but determined to let me know the church was taking the matter seriously and conducting a full financial review of all claimed donations from the past decade. Even Cole seemed to sense the walls closing in. Lila texted me that he'd suggested postponing the wedding until this legal mess blows over, which had made her suspicious enough to start asking questions he didn't want to answer. His careful construction was beginning to crumble under scrutiny. That Sunday, I returned to Sacred Heart and sat in the back pew again watching another service where my parents looked smaller and more isolated than I'd ever seen them. Afterward, as the crowd thinned, Pastor Ruth approached me in the church vestibule. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she took both my hands in hers. "Cassandra, sweetheart, the board met yesterday," she said quietly. "They've approved the use of May's trust fund for its intended purpose. There's a specific clause in the trust documents I need to show you, something May added right before she died." Ruth's grip tightened on my hands. "It's going to change everything." Ruth and I spent an hour in her office that Sunday afternoon going over the trust clause she'd mentioned, a provision May had added to the Community Harm Restoration Framework that gave me legal authority to use the fund for public events that would restore the church's reputation and honor May's legacy. The implications were staggering, but before I could fully process what it meant, my phone buzzed with a text from Lila asking if she could come over that evening. I said yes immediately, and then I went home to wait. She arrived at my apartment at 9 o'clock wearing a gray hoodie pulled low over her face, even though it was a warm evening. When I opened the door, I barely recognized her. My sister, who'd always been so carefully put together, looked wrecked. Her mascara had run in dark streaks down her cheeks. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and her hands shook as she stepped inside and immediately checked over her shoulder as if someone might be following her. "Are you okay?" I asked, closing the door and engaging the deadbolt. "I turned off my phone's location services," she said instead of answering. "I didn't want Cole to know where I was going. Is that paranoid? Am I being paranoid?" "No," I said gently. "You're being careful. There's a difference." She collapsed onto my couch and I sat beside her close enough to offer comfort, but far enough to give her space. For a long moment she just breathed, trying to compose herself, and I waited. "I need to show you something," she finally said, pulling out her phone with trembling fingers. "But you can't tell anyone yet. I'm still trying to figure out what to do." She opened her text messages and scrolled back several weeks, then handed me the phone. The conversation was between her and Cole, dated 3 weeks ago, right around the time I'd received that initial email banning me from the wedding. Lila had written, "Why isn't Cassandra invited? She's my sister. This feels wrong." Cole's response made my chest tighten. "Babe, your sister told your parents she didn't want to come. She said our wedding was frivolous and beneath her, that we were being irresponsible with money. Your parents are trying to protect you from her judgment. She's always been jealous of you, and they didn't want her negativity ruining your special day. Trust me, this is better for everyone." I read it twice, feeling a cold rage settle over me at how smoothly he'd lied, how perfectly he'd crafted a narrative that would keep Lila compliant while painting me as the villain. "I believed him," Lila whispered. "When you didn't respond to my texts after that, I thought it confirmed what he'd said. I thought you really did look down on me, that you'd always thought I was irresponsible and silly. But then the lawsuit happened and I saw the news article and nothing made sense anymore." She pulled back her phone and scrolled through more messages, showing me weeks of Cole deflecting her questions, soothing her concerns, keeping her isolated from information that might have helped her see the truth earlier. "There's more," she said, reaching into the bag she'd brought with her. She pulled out a thick 3-ring binder, the kind of wedding planning organizer sold at bridal stores, with clear plastic sleeves holding documents and photographs. "This is everything Cole gave me for planning. I want you to see it." I took the binder and opened it. The first section was full of glossy printouts from that Instagram account Sarah had showed me the destination. Dream's wedding photos of the model in the Vera Wang gown posed at the Fairmont Garden Estate. The images were beautiful, professionally shot, exactly the kind of inspirational content you'd expect in a bride's planning folder. "Cole told me these were just inspiration photos." Lila explained, her voice hollow. "He said my actual dress would be even better, more personalized." I was so excited. I flipped further into the binder and found a receipt printed from an email dated 2 weeks ago. The vendor was an online retailer I recognized from Sarah's report, and the item description was clear: designer-inspired bridal gown style, VW replica, size 6. The price, $1,200. The delivery date 10 days before the wedding. "I found that yesterday," Lila said. "I was looking for the venue contract because Mom asked me something about the timeline, and I found that receipt tucked in the back. When I asked Cole about it, he said it was a backup dress, just in case there were any last-minute issues with the real one. But Cassandra, there is no real dress. That replica is all there is." I kept turning pages and found the catering contract. The guest count clearly stated 50 people, not the 200 my parents had been billed for. There were notes in Cole's handwriting in the margins. "Tell parents 200 venue maxes at $120 anyway, bill for difference." I confronted him about the guest count, Lila continued. "He said my parents had upgraded everything as a surprise, but didn't want to stress me with budget discussions during the planning process. He told me to just trust him, that everything was handled, that I should focus on being a beautiful bride and let him handle the boring details." She started crying again, and this time I moved closer, putting my arm around her shoulders. I thought I was marrying someone who loved me, she sobbed against my shoulder. But he doesn't even see me. I'm just a pretty face for his scam, aren't I? I'm just a prop he's using to steal from my own family. You're not stupid, I said firmly, making her look at me. You're not naive or foolish or any of the things you're probably calling yourself right now. You're trusting. You believed someone you loved when he told you things that seemed plausible. That's not a character flaw, Lila. That's being human. And he weaponized that trust. She wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her hoodie. What do I do? The wedding's in 2 weeks. Everyone's invited. All of Cole's family, all of Mom and Dad's friends. If I cancel now, Mom will never forgive me. She'll say I'm ruining her reputation, embarrassing the family, throwing away my chance at happiness. I took both of her hands in mine, holding them steady. You don't have to face this alone anymore, but you do have to make a choice. Him or the truth. You can't have both. For a long moment, Lila just looked at our joined hands, at the physical evidence that maybe we could be sisters again instead of rivals. Maybe we could protect each other instead of competing for scraps of parental approval. Help me get out of this, she finally whispered. Please. I looked my sister in the eye and saw real trust there for the first time in years, saw her choosing me over the comfortable lie, and I made a decision. I have a plan, I said. But you have to trust me completely, and you can't tell Mom, Dad, or Cole anything until I say so. Can you do that? Lila nodded, and I saw determination replacing the fear in her expression. What's the plan? She asked. I smiled, really smiled for the first time in weeks. We're going to give this town the wedding it deserves, I said, just not the one they're expecting. By 10 o'clock that night, my dining room table had been transformed into what Lila nervously called investigation headquarters. I'd pulled out my laptop spread, Martin's financial analysis reports across one end, arranged Sarah's private investigator files on Cole in neat stacks, and positioned Emily's legal briefs where we could reference them easily. The wedding binder sat in the center like evidence at a crime scene, which, in a sense, it was. Lila sat across from me, still wearing that gray hoodie, but her tears had dried, and something harder had replaced the devastation in her eyes. She was angry now, and anger was useful. Anger could be channeled into action. Walk me through every vendor, I said, opening a fresh spreadsheet on my laptop. I want names, contact information, what they were supposed to provide, and what Cole told you about payment. We worked methodically, Lila reading from the binder while I typed and cross-referenced with the financial documents Martin had compiled. The wedding binder listed 15 vendors: florist, caterer, photographer, videographer, DJ, cake designer, venue coordinator, invitation printer, transportation service, hair and makeup team, officiant, rehearsal, dinner restaurant, and 3 decor rental companies. Call the florist, I said, handing Lila my phone. Pretend you're just confirming details about your bouquet. Ask casual questions. See what she says about payment. Lila's hands shook slightly as she dialed, but her voice was steady when the florist answered. I listened to her side of the conversation, watched her face go pale, watched her thank the woman, and hang up before looking at me with something close to horror. She said they're still waiting on the $2,000 deposit check that's bounced twice, Lila whispered. She said if they don't receive payment by the end of this week, they're pulling out of the wedding entirely. Cole told me the florist was paid in full 2 months ago. We called 4 more vendors using the same strategy, Lila asking innocent questions while I took notes. The caterer hadn't received final payment and was threatening to reduce the menu to basic options. The transportation service said their contract was never signed despite Cole's assurances. The makeup artist had only received half of her deposit and was considering canceling. Of the 15 vendors, 8 were either unpaid or severely underpaid, all while my credit card had been charged for their full invoices. Let me see those concept photos again, I said, and Lila pulled out her phone, scrolling to the images she'd saved from Cole's Instagram account. I transferred the files to my laptop and opened them in Photoshop, something I'd learned to do years ago for work presentations. I pulled up the metadata embedded in each image file, the digital fingerprints that photographers often forgot to scrub. And there it was, clear as day, the model's Instagram handle tagged in the original file properties. At Bridal Model Mia. I pulled up her Instagram profile on my phone. Mia Chen, Professional Bridal Model Portland, OR. Her feed was exactly what I expected, hundreds of photos of her in various wedding dresses at various venues, always tagged with vendor names and location credits. I scrolled back through her timeline and found the same Vera Wang dress appearing in 3 different weddings over the past year. It wasn't Lila's dress at all. It was a rental dress Mia used for promotional portfolio shoots. "Lila," I said carefully, "I need Cole's laptop password." She hesitated for only a second before reciting a string of numbers and letters. I pulled up Cole's email account through the cloud backup Martin had taught me to access for the investigation, and I searched for the photographer's name. The invoice appeared immediately, dated 3 months ago. Vendor portfolio session, 4 hours, $800. Client provided false bride name for privacy. Payment received in cash. I clicked into the attached notes the photographer had saved in his own files, probably never imagining anyone else would see them. Client insisted on no real names and contracts. Red flag, but paid cash up front, so didn't push the issue. Got weird vibes, but money cleared. Lila was reading over my shoulder now, and I felt her breath catch as the full picture came into focus. "He hired a model to pretend to be me," she said slowly. "He rented a dress I was never going to wear. He created fake social media accounts to scam vendors into giving discounts. He charged your credit card for services he never paid for, and he was going to pocket the difference." "It's worse than that," I said, pulling up Martin's financial analysis. "Based on the invoices versus actual vendor costs, Cole stands to pocket approximately $35,000 from the vendor fraud alone." "But Lila, think about the timeline. He needs this wedding to happen to collect that money. He needs the event to occur so he can claim everything was delivered as promised before anyone realizes the truth. And then..." I watched my sister's face as understanding crashed over her like a wave. "Then he'll leave," she finished, her voice hollow. "After the honeymoon, maybe after a few months of pretending everything's fine, he'll say the marriage was a mistake. He'll file for annulment, and he'll disappear with the money while everyone's too embarrassed to press charges because it'll mean admitting they were conned." She sat down heavily in the chair beside me, all the color draining from her face. "He doesn't love me," she said. "He's not even really marrying me. I'm just the actress in his commercial. I'm just the pretty face that makes the scam look legitimate." I reached over and squeezed her hand hard enough that she had to look at me. "You're not just anything," I said fiercely. "You're my sister. You're the person who had the courage to come to me when you realized something was wrong. You're the one who's choosing truth over comfort right now. And we're going to make sure everyone knows exactly who Cole is." We sat there for a moment, hands clasped across a table covered in evidence of systematic fraud, and for the first time in our adult lives, we weren't competitors. We weren't rivals for parental attention or approval. We were sisters' allies preparing to fight back against someone who'd tried to use both of us. My phone rang, shattering the moment. Pastor Ruth's name appeared on the screen, and I answered immediately. "Cassandra," Ruth said, her voice energized in a way I'd never heard before. "I just finished reading the full text of May's trust clause. I've been over it 3 times with our church attorney, and there's something extraordinary here." "What is it?" I asked, putting the phone on speaker so Lila could hear. "You can legally use the fund to host a public community event if it serves restorative justice purposes, specifically if it restores the church's reputation after being used in fraudulent schemes and honors May's legacy of genuine charitable giving." "Cassandra, what if we gave this town a real celebration, a genuine community event that shows what your grandmother stood for? What if we held it the same day as the wedding?" I looked at Lila across the table, saw the spark of hope mixing with fear in her expression, and smiled. "Ruth," I said, "I think that's exactly what we're going to do." By 10 o'clock that night, my dining room table had been transformed into what Lila nervously called Investigation Headquarters. I'd pulled out my laptop spread, Martin's financial analysis reports across one end, arranged Sarah's private investigator files on Cole in neat stacks, and positioned Emily's legal briefs where we could reference them easily. The wedding binder sat in the center like evidence at a crime scene, which in a sense it was. Lila sat across from me, still wearing that gray hoodie, but her tears had dried, and something harder had replaced the devastation in her eyes. She was angry now, and anger was useful. Anger could be channeled into action. "Walk me through every vendor," I said, opening a fresh spreadsheet on my laptop. "I want names, contact information, what they were supposed to provide, and what Cole told you about payment." We worked methodically, Lila reading from the binder while I typed and cross-referenced with the financial documents Martin had compiled. The wedding binder listed 15 vendors: florist, caterer, photographer, videographer, DJ, cake designer, venue coordinator, invitation printer, transportation service, hair and makeup team, officiant, rehearsal, dinner restaurant, and 3 decor rental companies. "Call the florist," I said, handing Lila my phone. "Pretend you're just confirming details about your bouquet. Ask casual questions. See what she says about payment." Lila's hands shook slightly as she dialed, but her voice was steady when the florist answered. I listened to her side of the conversation, watched her face go pale, watched her thank the woman, and hang up before looking at me with something close to horror. "She said they're still waiting on the $2,000 deposit check that's bounced twice," Lila whispered. "She said if they don't receive payment by the end of this week, they're pulling out of the wedding entirely. Cole told me the florist was paid in full 2 months ago." We called 4 more vendors using the same strategy, Lila asking innocent questions while I took notes. The caterer hadn't received final payment and was threatening to reduce the menu to basic options. The transportation service said their contract was never signed despite Cole's assurances. The makeup artist had only received half of her deposit and was considering canceling. Of the 15 vendors, 8 were either unpaid or severely underpaid, all while my credit card had been charged for their full invoices. "Let me see those concept photos again," I said. And Lila opened the wedding binder to the glossy printouts from Cole's Instagram account. I photographed several of the images with my phone and uploaded them to my laptop, then opened the files in the photo editing software I used occasionally for work presentations. I'd learned years ago that digital images carried metadata, invisible fingerprints that photographers often forgot to scrub from their files. When I opened the image properties panel there, it was a tagged Instagram handle embedded in the original file. At bridal model Mia. I pulled up Instagram on my phone and searched for the account. Mia Chen's profile loaded immediately: professional bridal model Portland OR. Her feed was a gallery of wedding perfection, hundreds of photos showing her in different gowns at different venues, each image meticulously tagged with vendor names and location credits. I scrolled through her timeline and found the Vera Wang dress appearing in at least 3 separate weddings over the past 18 months. It wasn't a dress anyone had purchased. It was a rental recycled across multiple promotional shoots for different vendors. "Lila, I need to access Cole's email," I said carefully. "Can you log into his cloud account?" She hesitated for only a moment before pulling her own laptop from her bag and typing in credentials she clearly knew by heart. The inbox loaded, and I searched for the photographer's name from the binder. The invoice appeared immediately, dated 3 months ago, and my stomach tightened as I read the description. Vendor portfolio session 4 hours, $800. Note: client provided false bride name for privacy purposes. Payment received in cash, no receipt requested. I clicked on the attached notes file the photographer had saved, probably never imagining anyone beyond himself would see it. The comments were brief, but damning. Client insisted on no real names in contracts. Gave me weird vibes, but he paid cash up front, so I didn't push the issue. Red flag, but the money cleared, so whatever. Lila was reading over my shoulder now, her breathing shallow and quick as each new piece of evidence clicked into place, like components of a machine designed to destroy her. "He hired a model to pretend to be me," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. He rented a dress I was never going to wear. He created an entire fake social media presence to con vendors into giving him discounts. He charged your credit card for services he never intended to pay for in full. And he was planning to keep the difference. It's more than that, I said, pulling up Martin's detailed financial analysis on my screen. The spreadsheet laid out every discrepancy between what had been charged to my credit and what vendors had actually received. Based on the invoices versus the actual contracted vendor costs, Cole stands to pocket approximately $35,000 from the vendor fraud alone. But Lila, think about the timeline here. He needs this wedding to actually happen. He needs the event to occur so he can claim all services were delivered as promised, so he can collect final payments, so he can maintain the illusion long enough to extract maximum profit. And then what? I watched my sister's face as understanding crashed over her like a cold wave. Her eyes went wide, her skin went pale, and her hands gripped the edge of the table. Then he leaves. She finished, her voice hollow with realization. After the honeymoon, maybe after a few months of pretending to be married, he'll say it was all a mistake. He'll claim we're incompatible. He'll file for annulment and disappear with the money before anyone realizes how much he stole, because everyone will be too humiliated to press charges or too worried about their reputations to make it public. She sat down heavily in the nearest chair, all the remaining color draining from her face as the full scope of Cole's plan became undeniable. "He doesn't love me," she said, and her voice cracked on the words. "He's not even really marrying me for real. I'm just the actress in his commercial. I'm just the pretty face that makes the whole scam look legitimate to everyone else." I moved to kneel beside her chair, taking both her hands in mine and squeezing hard enough to make her focus on me, instead of the abyss of betrayal opening beneath her feet. "You are not just anything," I said fiercely. "You're my sister. You're the person who had the courage to come here tonight when you realized something was wrong. You're choosing truth over comfort right now, and that takes more strength than you know. And I promise you we're going to make sure everyone knows exactly who Cole Matthews really is." We sat there in that moment, hands clasped across a dining room table covered in evidence of systematic fraud, and I felt something shift between us. We weren't competitors anymore. We weren't rivals fighting for scraps of parental approval. We were sisters finally preparing to fight back together against someone who'd tried to use both of us for his own gain. My phone rang, the sound sharp in the quiet apartment. Pastor Ruth's name appeared on the screen, and I answered on the second ring. "Cassandra," Ruth said, and her voice carried an energy I'd never heard from her before. "I just finished reading the complete text of May's trust clause with our church attorney. We've been over it 3 times to make absolutely certain, and there's something extraordinary buried in the language. You can legally use the fund to host a public community event if it serves restorative justice purposes, specifically if it restores Sacred Heart's reputation after being used in fraudulent schemes. What if we gave this town a real celebration? What if we held it the same day as the wedding?" The morning after Ruth's call, I met with Sarah Kim at her downtown office to review her complete investigative report on Cole Matthews. What she'd uncovered went far beyond the wedding fraud I'd already discovered. Sarah slid a thick folder across her desk, and I opened it to find a timeline that made my blood run cold. Cole Matthews had operated under 3 different limited liability companies over the past 5 years. The first was Prestige Events Company, registered in Delaware 4 years ago and dissolved 18 months later after accumulating thousands in unpaid vendor debts. The second was Luxury Lifestyle Consulting, which lasted barely a year before multiple client complaints forced its closure. The third and most recent was Dream Day Weddings LLC, registered just 8 months ago, right around the time Cole had started dating Lila. "He's not an amateur," Sarah explained, tapping her pen against a page showing a pattern of complaints filed with the Better Business Bureau. "This is his system. He targets engaged women from families with money and social standing, presents himself either as a wedding consultant with industry connections or, in your sister's case, as a romantic partner. He exploits family credit, manipulates vendor relationships, and then disappears before anyone can coordinate their complaints into legal action." She showed me copies of 2 small claims court filings from previous victims. One woman in Portland had sued him for taking a $5,000 deposit for wedding planning services and vanishing 3 weeks before her ceremony. Another in Tacoma had filed charges after discovering he'd opened credit cards in her name. Both cases had been settled quietly out of court for undisclosed amounts, which Sarah suspected meant Cole had paid just enough to avoid criminal prosecution while moving on to his next target. "He's a repeat offender who specializes in wedding fraud," Sarah concluded, "and he's gotten very good at it." While Sarah had been investigating Cole's history, Martin Chen had been working on something equally disturbing. He arrived at my apartment that afternoon with his laptop, and an expression that told me he'd found something significant. Lila was there too, having moved into my guest room temporarily to avoid questions from our parents and Cole. Martin opened his analysis on my dining room table, pulling up the catering invoice that had been charged to my credit card. "This claims 200 guests at $110 per plate, totaling $22,000, he said, highlighting the numbers. But when I cross-referenced it with the actual venue contract Lila provided, I found a problem. He showed us the venue's official documentation. Buried in the legal language was a fire marshal capacity rating 120 people, maximum occupancy for events with seated dining. "The venue literally cannot accommodate 200 guests, Martin explained. "It's physically impossible and would violate fire safety codes. Yet the catering contract includes something called a guest list verification clause, which means someone provided the caterer with an actual list of names confirming 187 attendees. Martin had obtained that list through a legal subpoena Emily had filed as part of building our fraud case. When he spread the printed pages across the table, I started scanning the names and immediately felt something was wrong. John Anderson, +1. Michael Stevens, family of 4. Jennifer Liu, +2. David Parkin guest. Sarah Johnson, +3. The names were generic, too. Generic like someone had grabbed common surnames and first names and assembled them into plausible-sounding guests. "I ran background checks on every name on this list," Sarah said, pulling out her own report. 60% of them match no one in your parents' social circles, no one in Lila's friend networks, no one in Cole's known associates. They're placeholder names, the kind of generic identities you'd use if you were padding a guest list to inflate costs." Lila looked like she might be sick. "How many real people are actually invited?" she asked quietly. I'd been working on answering that question myself. Using the pretense of confirming mailing addresses for thank you cards I'd spent the previous evening calling relatives and the few genuine friends I recognized on the list, I'd made a spreadsheet tracking confirmed attendees, and the number was damning. 45 people, I said, give or take. That's immediate family on both sides, maybe 10 of your actual college friends who RSVP'd yes, and about 15 people Cole listed as his business associates, though, given what we now know about his business history. Those are probably fellow scammers or people he's conned into thinking he's legitimate. Martin nodded grimly. Which means Cole fabricated 130 ghost guests. He created invoices based on 200 people, charged your credit card accordingly, negotiated with vendors for the actual 50-person count he knew would attend, and planned to pocket the difference. We're talking about catering, seating rentals, beverage service, party favors, programs, transportation. Every line item was inflated based on this fake guest count. "This isn't just wedding cost inflation," Emily Torres said when I called her with the findings. "This is textbook contract fraud and wire fraud. The moment those credit card charges crossed state lines for processing, which they did, this became a federal issue. Cassandra, if we wanted to push this angle, we could involve the FBI. This is organized fraud with a documented pattern of victims across multiple states." I sat at my dining room table that evening, with Lila beside me, both of us staring at the fabricated guest list spread across the surface. 130 fake people invented solely to justify theft. A wedding designed not as a celebration, but as a criminal enterprise. And at the center of it all, my sister, who'd thought she was planning the happiest day of her life while actually serving as the unwitting face of a con. There are 45 real people who think they're coming to a wedding. I said slowly, an idea beginning to form. People from our family, people from Lila's life, people who actually care about her. What if we gave them something real to attend instead? Lila looked at me confused. What do you mean? Pastor Ruth said we could use May's Trust to host a community event, something that would restore the church's reputation and honor people who actually contribute to our community instead of exploiting it. What if we invited everyone who matters? Everyone who's real to something authentic that happens the same day Cole's fake wedding is supposed to occur. I pulled out my phone and dialed Ruth's number. She answered on the second ring. Ruth, I said, I need to ask you something important. How fast can we plan a community gratitude gala? Ruth asked me to meet her at Sacred Heart's administrative office the following afternoon. And when I arrived, I found her sitting with a distinguished older gentleman in a three-piece suit, who introduced himself as Bernard Hoffman, the church's attorney. The same Bernard Hoffman who had helped Grandma May draft her estate plan 8 years ago. Thank you for coming, Cassandra, Bernard said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Ruth has filled me in on the situation with your family, and I've spent the morning reviewing your grandmother's trust documents in detail. What May created here is quite remarkable, and I want to make sure you understand both the power and the limitations of what she's given you. He opened a leather portfolio and pulled out the trust documents I'd seen before, but this time he turned to a specific section, highlighted in yellow, the Community Harm Restoration Clause that Ruth had mentioned. Let me read you the exact language May insisted we include, Bernard said, adjusting his reading glasses. If actions by May's descendants cause measurable harm to community institutions, such as fraudulent use of the church's name, damage to its reputation, or exploitation of its charitable standing, the trustee may authorize the beneficiary to deploy funds for public restorative activities that demonstrate the values May herself embodied during her lifetime. He looked up at me over his glasses. What this means in practical terms is that because your family used Sacred Heart's name on fake donation receipts and fabricated chapel fees, you can legally use May's money to restore the church's honor and reputation through genuine community service. Your grandmother anticipated this exact scenario. How much of the trust can I use? I asked. That depends on meeting 3 specific requirements, Bernard said, holding up 3 fingers. First, there must be documented public harm. The fake $30,000 in charitable donations your parents claimed over 5 years, plus the $5,000 chapel fee that never existed, more than satisfies this requirement. We have Ruth's testimony, church financial records, and tax documents proving the fraud occurred. He lowered 1 finger and continued. Second, the restorative activity must serve the community, not personal revenge. This is crucial. You cannot use the funds simply to embarrass your family or get back at them. The event you plan must have genuine community benefit, must honor people who've actually contributed to Sacred Heart's mission, and must demonstrate the values of authentic generosity that May believed in. I nodded, understanding. This wasn't about destroying my parents. It was about showing everyone what real integrity looked like. Third, Bernard said, lowering another finger, all expenditures must be transparent and publicly reported. Every dollar you spend from this trust must be documented and made available for public review. This prevents abuse of the fund and ensures that May's money is used exactly as she intended. Ruth leaned forward, her voice gentle. May didn't want you to destroy your family, sweetheart. She wanted you to show them what real integrity looks like by example. She wanted you to build something good from the damage they caused. Bernard pulled out a financial summary. The trust can cover up to $50,000 for a community celebration that meets these criteria. It can also cover vendor payments to those who were scammed by Cole, since compensating victims of fraud qualifies as restorative activity. And it can cover legal fees necessary to protect the church's reputation and ensure your family's fraudulent tax claims are properly addressed. $50,000. Enough to plan something meaningful, something that would stand in stark contrast to Cole's elaborate con. Enough to actually help people instead of exploiting them. "There's one more thing," Ruth said softly. She pulled out her laptop and opened a video file I recognized the recording of May's will. "There's a final section of your grandmother's message that I held back until you were ready to hear it. I think now is the time." She pressed play, and May's face appeared on screen, looking directly into the camera with an expression of fierce love and determination. "Cassandra, if you're hearing this part, you've chosen truth over comfort, and I'm so proud of you." May said, her voice strong despite the physical frailty visible in her frame. "The money I'm leaving you isn't for revenge. It's for restoration. I want you to show them that goodness isn't weakness, that kindness isn't stupidity, that generosity without strings attached is possible and powerful." May leaned closer to the camera, her eyes intense. "Show them that family isn't about bloodlines or obligation, or who can manipulate whom most effectively. Family is about who shows up when the chips are down. It's about who tells you the truth even when it's hard. It's about who stands beside you instead of using you as a stepping stone." Her expression softened, and I saw tears gathering in her eyes even as her voice remained steady. "And baby girl, don't you dare apologize for demanding better. Don't you dare make yourself smaller to accommodate their dysfunction. You are allowed to want more from the people who claim to love you. You are allowed to set boundaries. You are allowed to walk away from relationships that only take and never give." May's hand reached toward the camera as if she could touch me across time and death. "Use this gift to build something beautiful from the ashes they left behind. Show this community what real celebration looks like. Honor the people who've given without asking for recognition. And make me proud, sweetheart. Make me proud." The screen faded to black, and I sat there with tears streaming down my face. But for the first time since this nightmare began, they weren't tears of anger or hurt. They were tears of purpose, of clarity, of finally understanding what May had been trying to teach me all along. This wasn't about punishing my family anymore. It was about healing a community they'd damaged. It was about showing everyone, including myself, that there was a better way to be. I wiped my eyes and looked at Pastor Ruth, then at Bernard, feeling something crystallize inside me that felt like steel wrapped in grace. "I want to book the Sacred Heart Community Hall for a community gratitude gala," I said. "Same day and time as Lila's wedding. Can we do that?" Ruth smiled, and it was the kind of smile that held both sadness for what had been lost and hope for what could be built. "Honey," she said, "we can do better than that. We can invite everyone who was supposed to be at that wedding, everyone who actually matters, and show them what real celebration looks like." Planning the Sacred Heart Community. Gratitude Gala consumed the next week of my life, but it was the most purposeful work I'd done in years. Pastor Ruth and I met daily at the church, spreading blueprints of the community hall across her desk, sketching seating arrangements, discussing menu options. Vanessa Park, the wedding planner who'd come to me that midnight with evidence of Cole's fraud, joined our planning sessions with an enthusiasm that felt like redemption. "I want to help you do this right," Vanessa said during our first meeting. "I've spent 20 years planning events where people spend obscene amounts of money trying to impress people they don't even like. Let me help you plan something that actually matters." We designed the gala around a simple concept honoring people who gave without expectation of recognition. The guest list included teachers who tutored struggling students for free, nurses who volunteered at community health clinics, firefighters who'd organized toy drives for underprivileged children, and elderly volunteers who'd spent decades supporting Sacred Heart's meal programs. At the center of it all would be a video tribute to Grandma May showcasing her 40 years of quiet service to this community. The catering was arranged through the same company originally contracted for Lila's wedding. The one still owed $8,000 in unpaid deposits. When I called the owner, a woman named Teresa Martinez, and explained the situation, her voice went from wary to warm in seconds. "You're actually going to pay what they owe?" she asked, disbelief clear in her tone. "I'm going to pay what they owe, and I'd like to hire you for a new event," I said. "Same day, different venue, 100 guests. Real guests, not fabricated ones. people who deserve a good meal and genuine appreciation. Teresa agreed immediately, and when I wired the $8,000 owed plus a new deposit for the gala, she called me back in tears. "You have no idea what this means to my business. That debt was going to put me under. I'll make sure this is the best event I've ever catered." Word spread quickly through Seattle's wedding vendor network. The florist Diana Chen reached out after receiving payment for her bounced deposits. "I heard what you're doing," she said. "If you need flowers for your event, I'll provide them at cost. Actually, forget cost. Consider it my contribution to honoring May Lowe. That woman donated to my daughter's school fundraiser every year without fail." The photographer who'd done Cole's fake Instagram shoot called me personally, his voice heavy with guilt. "I should have known something was wrong when he insisted on fake names. I want to document your gala for free. I need to photograph something real for once, something that actually honors people instead of exploiting them." Even the Fairmont Garden Estate, the venue where Lila's wedding was supposed to occur, reached out. Their events manager explained they were considering canceling the Lowe contract entirely due to continued non-payment, and were wondering if I'd like to move my gala to their more prestigious location. "Let them keep the venue," I told her. "I want the contrast to be stark. They'll have their expensive estate with its marble fountains and manicured gardens. We'll be in the church community hall with folding chairs and potluck contributions. They'll have their fabricated elegance. We'll have authentic community. The venue doesn't matter when the people do." I kept the publicity simple and honest. No press releases trashing my family, no dramatic social media posts exposing their fraud. Just a straightforward announcement on Sacred Heart's community board and Facebook page. "Join us June 15th at 2 p.m. for the Sacred Heart Community Gratitude Gala, celebrating those who give without asking for recognition. Free admission open to all. Come honor the legacy of May Lowe and the countless volunteers who make our community stronger." The local newspaper picked it up as a human interest story. The headline read, "Local woman honors late grandmother with community service event." The article was brief, mentioning that the gala would celebrate volunteers and feature a tribute to May Lowe, a longtime church member known for her charitable work. It noted almost as an afterthought that the event was scheduled for the same day as a private family wedding, and for anyone paying attention, the connection was impossible to miss. Within 24 hours, the community rumor mill had connected all the dots. I started receiving text messages from extended family members I hadn't heard from in years asking carefully worded questions. "Saw the announcement about the gala, sounds lovely. Is everything okay with Lila's wedding? And interesting timing for your event. Should we RSVP to both?" The invitations I'd sent to the 45 real people from Cole's fabricated guest list had been deliberately neutral. "You're invited to the Sacred Heart Community Gratitude Gala," they read with date, time, and location. I didn't mention the wedding. I didn't need to. People understood they were being given a choice, and judging by the RSVPs flooding into the church office, most were choosing the gala. Pastor Ruth showed me the response list one afternoon, her expression both sad and satisfied. 87 confirmed attendees so far, she said, including 32 people who were on your sister's original wedding guest list. They're choosing authenticity over performance, Cassandra. They're choosing you. I was reviewing final menu details with Teresa when the letter arrived. A thick envelope certified mail from the law offices of Gerald Branson, attorney at law. Inside was a formal cease and desist demand on intimidating letterhead accusing me of intentional interference with contractual relations and malicious disruption of a private family celebration. It demanded I cancel the gala immediately or face legal action for damages exceeding $100,000. I photographed the letter and texted it to Emily Torres with a single question: "Can he actually do this?" Her response came back within minutes, and I found myself smiling as I read it. "Let him try. Discovery will be delicious." Emily Torres didn't waste time with defensive posturing. Within hours of receiving Cole's cease and desist letter, she filed a formal complaint with the King County District Attorney's Office attaching every piece of evidence we'd compiled over the past month. Wire fraud for the cross-state credit card charges, identity theft for the forged family contribution agreement, conspiracy to commit financial fraud for the coordinated scheme between Cole and my parents. The complaint was comprehensive, clinical, and damning, supported by fake guest lists, dual invoicing documents, Instagram scam screenshots, and sworn testimony from Vanessa Park. Emily also filed a motion to compel Cole to disclose all financial records related to the wedding bank statements for his 3 dissolved LLCs' transaction histories and every communication with vendors. The motion requested access to his tax returns and credit reports, forcing into the light everything he'd been hiding in the shadows of Delaware corporate structures and cash payments. His attorney will advise him to drop the cease and desist immediately, Emily explained over the phone. The moment he tries to follow through on that threat, we get full discovery powers. He can't afford to let us depose him under oath about his business practices. But here's the beautiful part. The DA doesn't need his cooperation to open an investigation. Once I filed that complaint with all our supporting evidence, the wheels started turning regardless of what Cole wants. She was right. Cole's attorney sent a terse email the next morning withdrawing the cease and desist threat, citing mutual interest in avoiding unnecessary litigation. But the damage was done. The preliminary investigation was already underway. My father called me that afternoon, and I almost didn't answer. When I finally picked up on the 5th ring, his voice sounded like it belonged to someone much older than the man I remembered. "Cassandra, please," he said, and I heard genuine fear threading through his words. "If you keep pushing this, your mother and I could be charged as accomplices." Cole told us everything was handled legally. We trusted him. We didn't know. For the first time in my life, I heard something that might have been accountability in my father's voice, or at least the beginning of it. But I'd learned not to mistake fear of consequences for genuine remorse. "Dad, you signed legal documents without reading them," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You used my credit without my permission. You banned me from a wedding and then sent me a $60,000 bill for it. You claimed charitable donations you never made. When exactly does your ignorance become willful?" Silence stretched between us, filled only by his labored breathing. "What do you want from us?" he finally asked, and the defeat in his voice should have felt like victory, but it just felt sad. "Transparency," I said. "Public acknowledgement of the fake church donations. And you let Lila make her own choice about this wedding without pressure or manipulation. No guilt trips, no threats, no emotional blackmail. You let her decide what's best for her life. And if we do that, will you drop this?" "I'll drop nothing," I said. "The investigation is already happening. But I'll stop actively pushing for criminal prosecution if you cooperate fully with authorities and make genuine restitution to the church and the community. That's the best offer you're getting." He agreed, his voice hollow, and hung up without saying goodbye. 2 days later, working with Martin Chen and the church's attorney, I published a financial transparency report on Sacred Heart's website. The document was deliberately careful with its language, naming no individuals, but laying out the facts with clinical precision. It detailed irregularities in claimed charitable donations over a 5-year period, totaling $30,000 that the church had never received. It noted that all documentation had been turned over to appropriate authorities for investigation. It thanked the community for their patience during this difficult revelation and announced that the May Low Community Justice Fund would be compensating Sacred Heart's meal program in full for the shortfall, ensuring that vulnerable community members wouldn't suffer for others' fraud. The report was factual, measured, and absolutely devastating. Within hours, it had been shared across neighborhood social media groups and discussed in text threads among church members. People who'd suspected something was wrong now had confirmation. The report didn't explicitly say the Lowe family stole from the church in May's name, but it didn't need to. Everyone understood. The social consequences arrived swiftly. My mother, who'd built her identity around her position in the church community and her network of society friendships, found herself suddenly isolated. Book club invitations went unanswered. At the grocery store, acquaintances who used to stop for long chats now offered tight smiles and hurried past. At Sunday service, the pew around my parents remained conspicuously empty, even as the church filled with people coming specifically to show support for Pastor Ruth and the transparency she'd demonstrated. I didn't take pleasure in watching my parents experience the natural consequences of their actions, but I didn't intervene to protect them either. This was what accountability looked like when it finally arrived after years of avoidance. The morning of the wedding, I woke to my phone vibrating insistently on my nightstand. 23 missed calls, all from the same number I didn't recognize. I was about to silence it when a voicemail notification appeared. The message was from Jennifer Hartley, the events manager at Fairmont Garden Estate, and her voice carried an urgency that made my stomach clench. "Ms. Lowe, this is Jennifer from the venue. You need to get down here immediately. Your sister just arrived in her wedding dress and she's asking for you." I was still processing the venue manager's frantic voicemail about Lila when Emily called with different urgent news. Cole's attorney had filed an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order requesting an immediate hearing to halt the Community Gratitude Gala scheduled for the next day. The motion claimed my event constituted malicious interference with a contractual wedding celebration and defamation through implication. A judge had agreed to hear arguments that afternoon at 2 o'clock, less than 24 hours before both the wedding and the gala were supposed to occur. "Pack everything," Emily said. "Every document, every piece of evidence. We're going to bury him in facts." I met Emily and Martin at the King County Courthouse an hour later. We arrived with 3 rolling briefcases containing organized evidence files, each document tagged and cross-referenced. Martin had created visual exhibits showing the financial fraud in easy-to-understand charts and timelines. Emily had prepared a legal brief that was simultaneously defensive and offensive, protecting my right to host the gala while exposing the criminal enterprise that had necessitated it. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, formal and austere, with dark wood paneling and the seal of Washington State mounted behind the judge's bench. Cole sat at the plaintiff's table with his attorney, Jerry Branson, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than he'd reported earning in the past year. Behind them, looking absolutely miserable, sat my parents. They wouldn't meet my eyes as I took my seat at the defense table. Lila wasn't there. She'd texted me that morning, "I can't be in that room with him, but I'm with you in spirit. Go get him." Judge Patricia Morales entered, and we all rose. She was a woman in her late 60s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent 30 years on the bench and had seen every trick in the book. Cole's attorney presented his argument first, painting me as a vindictive older sister, using a community event as a weapon to destroy my family's reputation and sabotage my sister's wedding out of jealousy. He claimed the timing and location of the gala were deliberately chosen to humiliate the family and steal guests from the wedding, and that my public statements about financial irregularities constituted defamation. When it was Emily's turn, she stood and methodically dismantled every claim. She presented the forged family contribution agreement alongside handwriting analysis from a certified forensic document examiner showing clear signature discrepancies. She showed credit card statements proving unauthorized charges dating back 3 months, each one corresponding to a wedding expense I'd never approved. She submitted vendor affidavits confirming Cole's dual invoicing scheme with testimony from Vanessa Park, describing how she'd been pressured to create fraudulent contracts. Martin had prepared an exhibit showing the fake guest list with background check results for each name. The visual was damning, 130 names highlighted in red, each one marking a non-existent person invented to inflate costs. "Your Honor," Emily said, her voice clear and strong, "the gala that Mr. Matthews wants to halt is a legally authorized use of my client's grandmother's trust fund." May Lowe specifically created a provision allowing for restorative community events when family members cause measurable harm to community institutions. The Sacred Heart Chapel was used fraudulently in tax filings and vendor contracts. My client isn't retaliating. She's restoring. She placed the trust documents in front of the judge, along with the financial transparency report we'd published and the falsified church donation tax records that had triggered this entire investigation. Cole's attorney tried to interrupt, arguing that hosting an event on the same day was proof of malicious intent, but Emily cut him off smoothly. Hosting a community service event honoring charitable volunteers is not retaliation, Your Honor. It's exactly what May Lowe intended with her estate. If the timing is inconvenient for Mr. Matthews, perhaps he should have considered that before committing wire fraud and identity theft. Judge Morales held up her hand for silence and spent several minutes reviewing the evidence Emily had presented. The courtroom was absolutely quiet except for the rustling of papers and the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Finally, the judge looked up, her expression unreadable. "Counselor," she said, addressing Cole's attorney, "your client is asking this court to prevent a charitable community event while simultaneously being investigated by the district attorney's office for wire fraud and identity theft. That's a bold strategy, and not one I find compelling." Jerry started to respond, but Judge Morales continued. "I find no legal basis to halt Ms. Lowe's community event. The evidence presented suggests that not only is she within her rights to host this gala, but that she has legitimate reasons rooted in her grandmother's estate plan to do so." She turned to me, and her expression softened slightly. "However, Ms. Lowe, I want to be clear. I am not making findings of fact today regarding the fraud allegations. That's for the criminal investigation to determine. What I am doing is denying this motion for a temporary restraining order. I am also ordering all parties to preserve all financial documents related to this matter and to refrain from harassment or contact with each other until these issues are resolved through proper legal channels." She banged her gavel, and it was over. We stood as Judge Morales exited, and I felt Emily's hand on my shoulder. "You just won round one," she whispered. As we gathered our briefcases and prepared to leave, I saw my father stand in the gallery section, opening his mouth as if to speak to me. I looked at him for a long moment, then turned and walked past him toward the exit. There was nothing he could say that would change what needed to happen tomorrow. That night, as I was going through my final checklist for the gala, double-checking table assignments and reviewing the program for the tribute to May, my phone rang. Mom's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it through 3 rings, my finger hovering over the decline button. But something made me answer. All I heard at first was crying, raw and broken in a way I'd never heard from my mother before. "Cassandra," she finally managed through sobs. "I'm so sorry. You were right about everything. Please, can we talk before tomorrow?" I told my mother I'd meet her, but not at home and not anywhere that felt like family territory. I suggested a 24-hour coffee shop in a neighborhood neither of us frequented, a place where we could talk without the weight of history pressing down on every word. She agreed immediately, her voice still thick with tears. I arrived first and chose a booth in the back corner away from the few other late-night customers scattered throughout the fluorescent-lit space. When my mother walked in at 11:15, I barely recognized her. She wore no makeup, her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she looked a decade older than the woman who'd sent me that clinical email uninviting me from the wedding just weeks ago. Her hands trembled as she slid into the seat across from me. "I failed you," she said before I could even speak, before the waitress could offer coffee or menus. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve the chance to explain. But I need to say it out loud. I failed you as a mother." The words hung between us, raw and unprecedented. In my entire life, I'd never heard my mother admit to failure at anything. After the hearing today, I finally read everything. Every document Emily presented, every piece of evidence Martin compiled. Your father brought it all home, and I spent 6 hours going through it. Her voice cracked. The fake contracts, the forged signature, the guest list full of people who don't exist. Cole told us you'd agreed to everything. He showed us emails that looked like they came from you. And we believed him because we wanted to believe him. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup the waitress had wordlessly placed in front of her, seeking warmth or stability or something to hold on to. Your father and I were so desperate for Lila to have the perfect wedding, the kind we couldn't afford for ourselves 40 years ago. We got married in my parents' backyard with folding chairs and a cake from the grocery store. It was beautiful, but I spent decades feeling like we'd started our marriage as less than. When Lila got engaged, I saw a chance to give her what I never had. I convinced myself it was about her happiness, but it was really about erasing my own shame. That doesn't explain using my credit, I said quietly. I know. She looked down at her coffee. I remembered that old card, the one we opened when you turned 18. We told you it was for building credit history, that we'd manage it for you. And then you went off to college and built your own financial life, and that card just sat there dormant. When Cole started talking about wedding costs when the numbers kept climbing, I thought about that card. I knew it was wrong. But I convinced myself you made good money, that you wouldn't even notice that we'd find a way to pay it back before you ever saw a statement. But you did notice, my mother continued, her voice barely above a whisper. And instead of coming clean, we panicked. Cole suggested we make it look like a family contribution, like you'd always planned to help. He's the one who created that fake agreement, but I signed off on it. I let him forge your signature because it was easier than admitting what we'd already done. Mom, I need you to tell me something, I said, leaning forward. Grandma May warned you about this, didn't she? My mother's face crumpled, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. When you were a baby, your grandmother sat me down and told me, don't use your children as emotional banks. Don't make them earn your love with achievement or money or sacrifice. I was furious with her for suggesting I would ever do that. But she'd already seen it starting. She took a shaky breath. When you were 7, May had set aside emergency funds for you and Lila, money specifically for daycare or doctor visits or genuine needs. I used it to buy new furniture for the living room and book a vacation to Hawaii. When May found out, she cut me off financially. She told me she loved me, but she wouldn't enable me to damage my children the way I was starting to. I didn't speak to her for 6 months. That's why she left the trust to me, I said, understanding clicking into place. She knew I'd ruin you the way I almost ruined my relationship with her, my mother confirmed. She protected you the only way she knew how, by making sure I couldn't access the money that could have been used to control you. I was so angry when her will was read. I thought she was punishing me, but she was saving you. The coffee shop around us had grown quieter, the few remaining customers drifting out into the night. We sat in that booth, mother and daughter, with 37 years of damage laid out between us, like the evidence Emily had presented in court. If you knew this was wrong, why did you ban me from the wedding? I finally asked. Why send me that bill at all? My mother's composure broke completely. Cole said if we didn't get money from somewhere, he'd walk away. He said Lila would be humiliated, that we'd lose all our deposits, that everyone would know we'd failed. We'd already sent invitations, made promises, spent money we didn't have. He had us trapped, and we made you the escape route. We turned you into the villain to save ourselves from embarrassment. So, what happens now? I asked. She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. Tomorrow, before anything else happens, I'm going to tell Lila everything. Every lie, every manipulation, every choice we made that hurt you both. And then I'm going to face whatever consequences come. I just wanted you to hear it from me first. You deserved better, Cassandra. You always did. I left that coffee shop at midnight emotionally exhausted and unsure whether what had just happened was the beginning of healing or simply another performance. When I got home and checked my phone, there was a voicemail from Jennifer at the Fairmont Garden Estate, timestamped 11:47. Ms. Lowe, I'm calling about tomorrow. We've had a development with the wedding venue. You really need to call me back tonight. I called Jennifer back immediately, my heart pounding as I waited for her to answer. When she did, her voice was tense with professional stress barely contained. The florist had arrived 3 hours late at the Fairmont Garden Estate because Cole hadn't paid the final invoice, and she'd only agreed to set up after he handed her cash in the parking lot. The caterer was refusing to unload food until receiving full payment, and Cole was on the phone screaming at vendors while my parents sat in a corner looking shell-shocked. The photographer had canceled entirely, choosing to honor his commitment to document the gala instead. I'm telling you this because your sister deserves to know what's happening, Jennifer said quietly. This isn't the wedding she planned. This is a disaster held together with duct tape and desperation. I thanked her and hung up, then pushed the information aside. I had my own event to focus on, and it was going to be everything Cole's wasn't honest, joyful, and real. The morning of both events unfolded in two completely different worlds. At Sacred Hearts Community Hall, I arrived at 8 to find volunteers already decorating with the simple but elegant flower arrangements Diana Chen had donated. The church choir was running through their repertoire in the corner, their voices filling the space with warmth. Elderly community members who'd known May for decades were setting tables with care, sharing stories about my grandmother as they worked. Everyone moved with purpose, but without stress, united by genuine affection rather than social obligation. I walked through the space directing setup with quiet efficiency, adjusting table placements, and reviewing the program for the tribute video. For the first time in weeks, I felt myself smiling. Without forcing it, felt the knot of anger and hurt that had lived in my chest beginning to loosen. By noon, when we opened the doors, the contrast between the two events was already stark. At the Fairmont Garden Estate, according to texts I was receiving from family members, caught in the chaos, only 12 people had shown up for the wedding ceremony scheduled to begin at 2. Cole's business associates, people no one in my family had ever met, scattered awkwardly through a venue designed to hold 200. My parents sat in the front row of empty pews while Cole paced near the entrance, checking his phone obsessively and making frantic calls to guests who weren't coming. At the gala, over 80 people streamed through the doors of the community hall. I recognized teachers who'd worked with May in literacy programs, nurses from the hospice, where she'd volunteered every Thursday for 15 years, members of her knitting circle who'd made blankets for homeless shelters. And yes, I recognized most of the 45 real people who'd been invited to Lila's wedding. They'd chosen authenticity over performance, substance over spectacle. Pastor Ruth stood at the entrance, welcoming each person by name, her face radiant with genuine joy. When the hall was full and everyone had found their seats, she moved to the small podium we'd set up and spoke without notes. "We're here today to honor those who give quietly, love deeply, and serve humbly. These are the values May Lowe embodied every single day of her 78 years, and these are the values we see reflected in each person being celebrated today. This isn't about grand gestures or expensive displays. This is about showing up, about doing the right thing even when no one's watching, about building community through consistent acts of kindness." The program began with the video tribute to May, and I watched the faces in the audience as images of my grandmother appeared on the screen. There were tears, but they were the good kind, the kind that come from remembering someone who truly mattered. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away, Lila stood in the bridal suite of the Fairmont Garden Estate at 1:30 minutes before the ceremony was supposed to begin. She told me later what that moment felt like, staring at her reflection in the cheap replica dress, mascara already running from crying, holding a bouquet that had been thrown together by a florist who'd only showed up after being paid in crumpled bills. Through the window, she could see the nearly empty venue, could hear Cole's raised voice as he argued with someone on the phone. Her phone buzzed with a text from her college roommate, Emma. "I'm at the gala, Lila. Your grandma would be so proud of Cassandra. Wish you were here." That's when Cole appeared in the doorway, his smile tight and performative. "Babe, it's fine. Intimate weddings are totally trendy now. Some people couldn't make it, but that just makes it more meaningful, right?" Lila looked at him, really looked at him, and saw what I'd seen weeks ago. Not love, not partnership, not a future worth building. Just calculation, manipulation, a man running a con that was falling apart in real time. She thought about me sitting in that coffee shop with our mother, hearing apologies that came 37 years too late. She thought about Grandma May, who'd seen through the dysfunction and tried to protect us both. She thought about every lie Cole had told, every way he'd isolated her from the truth, every moment she'd chosen his comfortable deception over difficult reality. And she made a choice. She dropped the bouquet on the floor, lifted the hem of her wedding dress to reveal the running shoes she'd worn for comfort, and ran. Out of the bridal suite, down the elegant hallway, past the nearly empty venue where the pianist played, to chairs that would never be filled. She ran across the parking lot and down the sidewalk, her dress trailing behind her, tears streaming down her face, but her direction absolutely certain. I was mid-conversation with Mrs. Chen, one of May's oldest friends, when the community hall doors burst open with a crash that made everyone turn. There stood Lila in her wedding dress and running shoes, gasping for breath, mascara streaked down her cheeks, looking absolutely wrecked and absolutely sure. The entire room fell silent. 80 people frozen watching my sister stand in that doorway like someone who'd just escaped a burning building. And then she looked directly at me and said the words that changed everything. "I'm sorry. I choose you." The community hall froze in that moment, 80 people suspended in time, all eyes on Lila standing in the doorway in her wedding dress and running shoes. I was mid-sentence with Mrs. Chen, my glass of sparkling cider halfway to my lips, and for 3 heartbeats nobody moved. The only sound was Lila's ragged breathing and the faint echo of the door she'd crashed through. Then I set down my glass and walked toward my sister. Not rushing, not hesitant, just steady and sure. With each step, the years of competition and comparison and fighting for scraps of approval seemed to fall away, leaving only what had always been underneath 2 girls who'd needed each other all along. Lila's voice cracked as I reached her. "I couldn't do it. I couldn't marry him. I couldn't keep pretending that any of it was real." I didn't say I told you so. I didn't lecture or remind her of all the warnings she'd ignored. I simply opened my arms, and Lila collapsed into them like someone who'd been holding herself upright through sheer force of will, and had finally found a place where she could let go. She sobbed against my shoulder, her whole body shaking, and I held her tightly while her wedding dress pooled around our feet. The room erupted in applause, but it wasn't the polite golf claps of a formal event. It was genuine, supportive, the kind of applause that celebrates courage rather than performance. These people understood what it took for Lila to run away from a wedding in front of a nearly empty venue to choose truth over the fantasy everyone had invested in. Pastor Ruth appeared beside us with a soft knitted shawl, the kind May used to make for the church's winter clothing drive. She draped it around Lila's bare shoulders with gentle efficiency. "Welcome home, sweetheart," Ruth said softly. "You're exactly where you're supposed to be." What happened next wasn't dramatic or theatrical. There were no speeches about redemption or public declarations of sisterhood. Instead, something quieter and infinitely more powerful unfolded. Ruth and I guided Lila to a table where May's closest friends sat, women in their 70s and 80s who'd known our grandmother for decades. Mrs. Chen, who'd taught alongside May in the literacy program, immediately took Lila's hand in both of hers. Her grip was warm and steady, the kind of touch that conveyed safety without words. "Your grandmother once told me something I've never forgotten," Mrs. Chen said, her voice carrying the gentle authority of accumulated wisdom. "She said the bravest thing a person can do is walk away from a beautiful lie toward an ugly truth. You just did that, honey. May would be so proud of you." Someone brought Lila a plate of food from Teresa's catering spread. Someone else poured her a glass of sparkling cider. The women at the table shifted to make space, and suddenly my sister was surrounded by people who wanted nothing from her except her well-being. No expectations, no demands, no performance required. Just acceptance, and the kind of love that doesn't need to be earned. I sat down beside Lila and she immediately leaned into me, her head resting on my shoulder the way it used to when we were kids before everything got complicated. The program continued around us. The video tribute to May played on the projection screen, showing images I'd carefully curated: May volunteering at the food bank, May reading to children at the library, May laughing at a church picnic with her knitting circle gathered around her. There were photos of May with baby Cassandra teaching me to bake cookies in her kitchen. Photos of May with toddler Lila helping her plant flowers in the garden. The church choir performed, their voices rising in harmonies that filled the simple community hall with something transcendent. Local heroes were called forward one by one to receive small plaques and heartfelt recognition. A nurse who'd spent 30 years in hospice care, a teacher who'd tutored struggling students every Saturday for free, a firefighter who'd organized toy drives for children in the hospital. Each person was celebrated not for grand gestures, but for consistent, quiet service. "I ruined your event," Lila whispered as the afternoon stretched into early evening, and people lingered over coffee and dessert, reluctant to leave the warmth of genuine community. I shook my head, squeezing her hand. "You made it better. This whole thing was about showing what family should actually be, and you just proved it. Family isn't who's obligated to show up. It's who chooses to." We sat there in comfortable silence, watching strangers who'd become friends over the course of a single afternoon laugh and share stories and find connection in the absence of pretense. This was what May had wanted, what her trust fund had been designed to create. Not revenge or destruction, but restoration. Not tearing people down, but building something real from the rubble of what was false. Outside, though we didn't know it yet, police cars were pulling up to the Fairmont Garden estate. Cole, realizing Lila wasn't coming back, and that his carefully constructed scam had collapsed entirely, had attempted to flee with the cash gifts from the 12 guests who'd actually attended. One of those guests, someone with more sense than loyalty, had called 911. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, a sound we couldn't quite hear over the choir's final song. We were cutting into the simple sheet cake donated by the church's baking ministry, distributing slices to guests who'd stayed through the entire celebration, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out to see a text from Jennifer, the venue manager. "Police are here. Cole's in custody. You need to see this." I stared at the screen for a moment, then turned it so Lila could read the message. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a complicated mixture of emotions I couldn't quite parse. "Is it over?" she whispered. I squeezed her hand, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment, everything that still needed to be resolved. "Not yet," I said. "But almost." 2 hours after Lila arrived at the gala in her wedding dress, while we were still surrounded by the warmth of community celebration, police were executing a search warrant at the Fairmont Garden estate. Emily had worked with the district attorney to expedite the warrant based on the mountain of evidence we'd compiled, and officers arrived with instructions to seize financial records, electronics, and any documentation related to Cole's business operations. What they found went beyond paperwork. In Cole's garment bag tucked away in the groom's preparation room, an officer conducting a thorough search discovered something hidden inside a sock that had been stuffed into a dress shoe. It was an engagement ring, vintage and distinctive, with a platinum band featuring intricate filigree work and 3 diamonds set in a style unmistakably from the 1940s. The officer photographed it according to evidence protocol and examined the inside of the band, finding an engraving that made him pause. "To May Forever Yours, 1948. A quick call to the district attorney's office, a check against probate records from May's estate settlement 8 years ago. And the pieces fell into place. The ring matched an item specifically listed in May's will: platinum engagement ring with filigree detail and 3 diamonds bequeathed to granddaughter Cassandra Lowe, sentimental value, appraised value, $12,000. The ring had disappeared during the estate settlement process. Everyone had assumed it was lost in the chaos of sorting through May's belongings. It hadn't been lost. It had been stolen. I was helping clean up after the gala stacking chairs alongside Lila and several volunteers when Detective Sarah Morrison called my cell phone. She explained what they'd found and asked if I could identify the ring from a photograph she'd send to my email. I pulled up the image on my phone and the breath left my lungs. I'd completely forgotten about that ring. In the grief and logistics following May's funeral, when the ring hadn't turned up during the estate inventory, I'd simply accepted its absence as one more loss in a season of loss. But there it was on my screen, unmistakable and heartbreaking, the ring my grandfather had given May when he proposed in 1948. "Do you know how Mr. Matthews obtained this ring?" Detective Morrison asked. "I have no idea," I said, my voice shaking. "I haven't seen it since before my grandmother died." From across the community hall, my mother's voice cut through the lingering conversations. "I gave it to him." Everyone turned to look at her. She'd arrived at the gala late after Lila's dramatic entrance, slipping in through the back and sitting quietly in a corner. I hadn't turned her away, but I hadn't acknowledged her either. Now she stood, her face pale, but her posture straight, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. After May's funeral, I was helping sort through her jewelry. My mother said, her voice carrying across the now silent hall. I found the ring in her jewelry box. I knew the will said it was meant for Cassandra, but I thought Lila deserved something special for her engagement. Something with family history. I convinced myself Cassandra would never miss it, that she'd probably forgotten it even existed. She looked directly at me, her eyes red but dry. I gave it to Cole 6 months ago when they got engaged. I told him it was a family heirloom, that it should be Lila's engagement ring. I thought I was being generous, spreading the inheritance around more fairly. Lila's sharp intake of breath beside me was audible. "He never gave me that ring," she said. "The ring he proposed with was new from a chain jewelry store. He said he wanted me to have something modern, something that was just ours." Detective Morrison's voice came through my phone speaker, which I'd forgotten I was still holding. "Ms. Lowe, based on what I'm hearing, it appears Mr. Matthews received stolen property and kept it as collateral. We found it hidden in his belongings, not on anyone's finger. He was likely planning to pawn it." The theft of May's ring added another charge to Cole's growing list, receiving stolen property, a felony that carried its own penalties beyond the wire fraud and identity theft charges already filed. But the legal implications mattered less to me in that moment than what the ring represented. A week later, I stood in the evidence room at the police station with Detective Morrison. She handed me a sealed evidence bag containing May's ring, now cleaned and polished, catching the fluorescent light with the same gentle sparkle I remembered from my childhood. "It's yours now, Ms. Lowe," Detective Morrison said, "legally and rightfully." I opened the bag carefully and slid the ring onto my right hand. It fit perfectly, as if May had somehow known across 8 years and the barrier of death that it would eventually find its way back to me. The weight of it felt substantial, but comfortable, precious metal and stones that carried the story of a marriage that had lasted 53 years until death parted them. I would wear it not as an engagement ring, but as something more important, a reminder that inheritance isn't just about money or jewelry. It's about values, about the courage to do what's right, even when it costs you something. May's real gift hadn't been the trust fund or even this ring. It had been teaching me that I was worth defending, that I deserved better than a family that saw me as a resource to be extracted rather than a person to be loved. That Sunday, Pastor Ruth called a special meeting at Sacred Heart. "I think it's time," she'd said when she phoned me. "Time for the truth to be spoken aloud in a sacred space with witnesses who care about healing rather than hiding." So we gathered my parents in the front pew, looking smaller and older than I'd ever seen them. Lila beside me in the second row, her hand gripping mine. Extended family members scattered throughout the chapel, people who'd heard pieces of the story and deserved to hear it whole. When Pastor Ruth stood at the pulpit and said, "It's time for the truth to be spoken aloud," I realized this was the real ceremony we'd all been avoiding. Pastor Ruth stood at the pulpit in the chapel where May had worshipped for 40 years, and she didn't soften what needed to be said. The pews were filled with the church board key community members who'd been part of Sacred Heart for decades, and our family scattered among them like defendants awaiting sentencing. "For the past 5 years," Ruth began, her voice clear and unwavering, "donations totaling $30,000 were claimed under Sacred Heart's name on tax returns filed by the Lowe family. Sacred Heart received none of these funds. This constitutes fraud against both the IRS and this community's trust." She let that statement hang in the air, and I watched people shift uncomfortably, heard the whispers that rustled through the chapel like wind through leaves. "However," Ruth continued, "the Lowe family has come forward to make this right. Richard and Margaret Lowe have asked to address the community directly." My father stood, and I was struck by how much he seemed to have aged in the past month. His hands shook as he unfolded a piece of paper, a statement prepared with guidance from his attorney to ensure he didn't incriminate himself further while still taking responsibility. I, Richard Lowe, take full responsibility for fraudulent charitable donation claims made under Sacred Heart Chapel's name. He read, his voice barely steady. I did not verify information provided to me. I signed documents without proper review. And through my negligence and willful ignorance, I harmed this community and violated the trust you placed in me. He paused, swallowing hard. I am working with authorities to repay all owed taxes and penalties. I am resigning from the Church Finance Committee effective immediately, and I will spend whatever time I have left trying to make amends for the damage I've caused. He sat down heavily, and my mother stood. Unlike my father, she had no prepared statement, no attorney-approved language to hide behind. What came next was raw and unscripted. I stole from my own mother's legacy, she said, her voice breaking almost immediately. I stole from my daughter's future. I enabled a con man because I was more worried about what people would think than what was right. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. She just stood there, exposed and accountable in a way I'd never seen her before. May tried to warn me 30 years ago that I was raising my children to be competitors instead of family. She told me I was teaching them that love was conditional, that approval had to be earned through achievement or sacrifice. I told her she was overreacting, that she didn't understand modern parenting. My mother's laugh was bitter and broken. But she understood perfectly. She saw what I was becoming, and she tried to stop it. I didn't listen, and I almost destroyed the best thing I ever created, which was my daughter's love for each other. She turned away from the congregation and looked directly at Lila and me, her eyes red and pleading. I can't undo what I've done. I can't give you back the childhoods you deserved or erase the pain I've caused. But I can stop lying. I can stop making excuses. And I can stop asking you to carry the weight of my mistakes and my shame. Beside me, Lila was crying silently, and I felt my own throat tighten with emotions I couldn't quite name. This was what I'd wanted: accountability, honesty, the acknowledgement that what had happened wasn't normal or acceptable. But hearing it spoken aloud in front of witnesses was more painful than I'd expected, like lancing a wound that had festered for decades. The chapel was silent except for my mother's quiet weeping as she sat down. Then I stood and I felt every eye in the room turn toward me. The tension was palpable, everyone waiting to see if I would show mercy or deliver judgment. I don't forgive you yet, I said, and I watched my mother flinch at the words. Forgiveness isn't something you demand or expect on a timeline. It's something you earn through consistent action over time. But I'm willing to let you try. I laid out my conditions with the same precision I'd use in a business negotiation, because that's what this was: a contract for potential reconciliation with clear terms and consequences. You will enter financial counseling and work with a therapist who specializes in family systems. You will make restitution to the church through a payment plan that you fund yourselves. I won't cover it, and neither will May's trust. You will have no say in how Lila or I live our lives moving forward. No guilt trips, no manipulation, no attempts to control our choices through emotional blackmail. I paused, making sure they understood the most important condition. And you don't get to rewrite this story. What happened, happened. You don't get to pretend it was all a misunderstanding or blame Cole for everything. He was the catalyst, but you made choices long before he appeared. You forged documents. You used my credit. You stole from May's legacy. You enabled abuse because it was easier than facing the truth. Own it. All of it. My father nodded, his face crumbling with the weight of genuine remorse. My mother whispered, "We will," so quietly I almost didn't hear it. I sat back down beside Lila, who immediately took my hand and squeezed it hard enough to hurt. This wasn't a happy ending where everyone hugged and cried and pretended the past could be erased with a few tearful apologies. This was the beginning of something uncertain and difficult, a long road toward potential healing that might not ever reach the destination we hoped for. But it was honest, and after 37 years of performance and pretense, honesty felt like its own kind of victory. As we filed out of the chapel into the spring sunshine, people approached my parents with varying degrees of warmth or coldness, and I realized the community was making their own judgments about what accountability looked like and whether it was sufficient. Pastor Ruth caught my arm as I was walking toward my car with Lila. "There's one more thing May wanted you to have," she said, pulling a sealed envelope from her bag. It was smaller than the others, with my name written in May's handwriting across the front, and a single instruction below it: to be opened after you decide what to do with the rest of the trust fund. I took the envelope, feeling its weight in my hand, and looked at Ruth with questions I didn't know how to ask. "May knew you'd reach this point," Ruth said softly. "She knew you'd have choices to make about moving forward, and she wanted to give you one last piece of guidance when you were ready to hear it." 3 months after that Sunday at Sacred Heart, after the apologies and the accountability and the tentative first steps towards something that might eventually resemble healing, I sat in a lawyer's office filing paperwork to establish the May Low Community Justice Fund as a registered 501c3 nonprofit organization. The initial endowment came from what remained of May's trust, after gala expenses, and the church restitution payments $130,000 that would be used to help people navigate the same nightmare I'd survived. The mission statement took me weeks to write, revising and refining, until it captured exactly what May had intended: empowering individuals to seek truth, demand accountability, and rebuild dignity when family systems fail them. The foundation would provide micro-grants to people facing family financial abuse, elder fraud, or wedding-related scams, connecting them with the attorneys, forensic accountants, and private investigators they needed to fight back. I served as board president, handling oversight and strategic direction, but the executive director running day-to-day operations was Lila. She'd found unexpected purpose in helping others navigate what she'd survived, and watching her transform her pain into advocacy was one of the few genuinely beautiful things to emerge from the wreckage. Our first act as a foundation was paying legal fees for 3 other victims of wedding vendor fraud that Sarah had identified during her investigation of Cole. 2 women in Portland and 1 in Spokane, all of whom had discovered too late that their fiancés were running elaborate cons. We connected them with Emily Torres, helped them file police reports, and walked them through the process of reclaiming their credit and their dignity. Within 6 months, the foundation had helped 19 people. An 82-year-old woman whose son had been draining her pension through a power of attorney he'd manipulated her into signing. A 26-year-old man whose parents had opened 17 credit cards in his name and destroyed his credit score before he even knew what credit was. 2 more brides who'd discovered, like Lila, that their weddings were money laundering operations disguised as celebrations. We didn't just write checks. We connected people with resources, held their hands through legal proceedings, referred them to therapists who specialized in family trauma, and built a network of professionals willing to work at reduced rates for foundation clients. The local news ran a feature story 6 months after we launched: "Grandmother's Legacy Becomes Lifeline for Fraud Victims." The reporter interviewed me in the foundation's small office, and I kept my answer simple when she asked what May would think of what we'd built. My grandmother taught me that the opposite of abuse isn't revenge. It's restoration. We're not here to destroy families. We're here to hold them accountable so that healing becomes possible. Sometimes that means prosecution. Sometimes it means boundaries. But it always means truth. The story aired on a Tuesday evening, and by Wednesday morning our phone was ringing with people who needed help, who'd been searching for someone who understood that family abuse was real and devastating, and not something you just got over because they were blood. As part of their restitution agreement, my parents volunteered 10 hours per week at the foundation. Dad handled administrative paperwork under close supervision with no access to finances or client information beyond what was necessary for filing. Mom ran a support group for parents who'd harmed their adult children and wanted to make amends, a role that forced her to confront weekly what she'd done to Lila and me. They didn't receive praise for their work, In fact, they were often confronted by foundation clients whose stories mirrored their own actions, and I watched them struggle with the discomfort of seeing themselves reflected in people they might have once judged. But slowly, painfully, they began to understand not just what they'd done, but why it mattered, why it had caused the damage it did. Thanksgiving came 8 months after the gala that had changed everything. We gathered at my apartment, just the four of us, for a quiet dinner that felt nothing like the performative holiday meals of my childhood. There were no elaborate decorations, no expensive wine chosen to impress, no conversation carefully curated to avoid uncomfortable truths. Lila brought a pumpkin pie she'd made herself, slightly lopsided, but genuine. Dad helped me wash dishes without being asked, working in companionable silence at my kitchen sink. And when Mom tentatively asked if she could see photos from the Foundation's latest event, a resource fair we'd held for family fraud victims, I pulled out my phone and showed her. We looked through the pictures together, and I watched her face as she saw the people we'd helped, the community we'd built from the ashes of what she and Dad had nearly destroyed. She didn't cry or apologize again. She just nodded and said quietly, "May would be proud of this." It wasn't forgiveness. I still carried anger and hurt that would take years to fully process. But it was coexistence, and for now that felt like enough. After everyone left, after Lila hugged me goodbye, and my parents drove away in their aging sedan, I remembered the envelope Ruth had given me months ago, the one I'd tucked into my desk drawer and kept forgetting to open. May's final message, the one I was supposed to read after deciding what to do with the trust fund. I retrieved it from the drawer and settled onto my couch. May's ring warm on my right hand as I carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single handwritten letter on May's personal stationery, her elegant cursive flowing across the page. The date at the top was 1 week before she died. "Cassandra, if you're reading this, you've chosen love over bitterness. Now I need to tell you the real reason I left you the money." May's handwriting blurred slightly as tears filled my eyes, but I kept reading, absorbing every word of her final message. "I left you the money not because I thought you'd need it, you're strong enough to thrive without it, but because I needed to know that my resources wouldn't die with me serving the wrong purpose. I watched my daughter use guilt as currency, love as leverage, and family as a transaction. I was terrified she'd do the same to you and Lila. So I gave you a choice. You could take the money and disappear, cut them off, and live well. You'd be justified. Or you could use it to show them and yourself that there's a better way. You chose better. I knew you would. That's why you were always my favorite. Don't tell Lila." I laughed through my tears at that last parenthetical, so perfectly May, even in death maintaining her sense of humor and her understanding that favorites weren't really the point. The letter continued, "The ring I left you. It's not just jewelry, sweetheart. Your grandfather gave it to me after I stood up to my own abusive family, after I walked away from people who saw me as property rather than a person. I wore it every day as a reminder that I'd chosen myself, that I'd broken a cycle that had run in my family for generations. Now it's yours. Wear it the same way. You are the cycle breaker, Cassandra. You always have been." I set the letter down carefully and looked at the ring on my right hand, seeing it now not just as a family heirloom, but as a deliberate inheritance of courage, a symbol passed from one woman who'd refused to accept abuse to another. 2 weeks after reading May's letter, a journalist from a regional news magazine contacted me about doing a feature story. The article, when it published, was titled, "How One Woman Turned Family Betrayal into Community Healing." The journalist had interviewed gala attendees, foundation beneficiaries, vendors who'd been scammed by Cole, and even Vanessa Park, who provided a quote that became the pull-out text featured prominently in the layout. "Cassandra could have destroyed her family publicly," Vanessa said. "She had every piece of evidence she needed to humiliate them, to make them social pariahs, to ensure they suffered the way she'd suffered. Instead, she built something that helps strangers. That's not revenge. That's grace with a backbone." During my interview, the journalist had asked the question I'd been asked dozens of times since the foundation launched: "Do you consider what you did revenge?" I'd thought carefully before answering, wanting to be precise about the distinction that mattered so much to me. Revenge would have been leaking their fraud to the press before giving them a chance to make it right, I said. Revenge would have been taking the money and cutting them off forever, leaving them to drown in the consequences without any possibility of redemption. What I did was set boundaries with consequences. I didn't let them abuse me, but I didn't abuse them back. I just refused to be their safety net while they were still setting fires. I held them accountable while leaving the door open for them to become better people if they chose to do the work. 1 year after the gala that had changed everything, I sat in my office at the foundation headquarters, a small suite we'd rented in a building near Sacred Heart. I'd reduced my hours at my corporate financial analyst job to part-time, devoting most of my energy to running the foundation and speaking at conferences about family financial abuse. May's ring caught the afternoon light as I typed an email, and my desk held the artifacts of a life I'd built from wreckage, a framed photo from the gala showing Lila hugging me, both of us laughing genuinely for the first time in years. A thank you card from an 82-year-old woman named Dorothy, whose son had stolen her pension and who'd recovered it with the foundation's help. An invitation to keynote a national conference on financial elder abuse scheduled for the following spring. My phone buzzed with a text from Lila. Foundation board meeting still at 6. I smiled and typed back, "Yes, bring Dad's budget report. He actually did it right this time." And he had. Slowly, through months of supervised work and uncomfortable confrontations with the reality of what he'd done, my father was learning basic accountability. It wasn't redemption yet. It might never be complete redemption. But it was progress, and after 37 years of stagnation and denial, progress felt revolutionary. I didn't smile because everything was perfect, or because my family had been magically healed by apologies and volunteer work. I smiled because I'd built something meaningful from pain, because I'd chosen restoration over destruction, because I no longer measured my worth by my parents' approval or lack thereof. The real victory wasn't that my family had finally apologized, or that Cole was facing federal charges, or that the foundation was helping people. The victory was internal and private. I'd learned that I deserved better, and I'd had the courage to demand it, and I'd discovered that my value existed independent of anyone else's recognition. That evening, as our board meeting wound down and volunteers were putting away chairs and packing up leftover coffee, a young woman approached me hesitantly. She was in her mid-20s with red-rimmed eyes and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from crying and not sleeping and carrying a weight you don't know how to set down. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you Cassandra Lowe?" I nodded, and she continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. "My parents sent me a bill for my sister's wedding that I wasn't invited to, $25,000. They said it was my obligation as family. I don't know what to do. I found your foundation online and Can you help?" I looked across the room at Lila, who was talking with one of our volunteer attorneys. She must have felt my gaze because she turned and met my eyes, and in that glance we had an entire conversation. She nodded, understanding immediately what I was asking. I turned back to the young woman and felt May's ring, solid and reassuring on my finger, felt the weight of everything I'd survived and learned and built. "Yes," I said, "we can help. Let me tell you a story." 18 months after the gala that had rewritten my family's story, I hosted Thanksgiving dinner at my apartment for the first time. It was a small gathering, just the four of us. And what made it remarkable was that everyone was there by choice, rather than obligation. No guilt trips, no performative family loyalty, just four people who'd decided that showing up was worth the discomfort of facing each other honestly. Lila arrived early to help me cook something that would have been unthinkable 2 years ago when we were still competing for scraps of parental approval. We worked side by side in my kitchen, chopping vegetables and basting the turkey, talking about her new apartment and the foundation case she was managing for a woman whose daughter had forged her name on a reverse mortgage. Mom arrived with a store-bought pumpkin pie from the grocery store bakery, no pretense of having made it herself. No elaborate story about a family recipe. She'd stopped trying to perform perfection, and the absence of that performance made her presence more bearable. Dad set the table without being asked. Moving quietly through my dining room, arranging plates and silverware with careful precision, he was still learning how to be present in a space without trying to control it, still discovering that participation didn't require dominance. When we sat down to eat, there was no elaborate blessing, no forced recitation of things we were grateful for, no performance for an audience that didn't exist. Dad simply said, "I'm glad we're here," and the rest of us murmured agreement, and that was enough. Over dinner, we talked about real things. Lila shared that her therapist had helped her recognize a pattern of seeking external validation, of building her identity around other people's perceptions rather than her own values. "I'm learning that I don't need to be liked by everyone," she said. "I just need to like myself." Mom admitted that her volunteer work at the foundation was harder than she'd expected. "Facing what I did to other people's children makes me see what I did to you and Lila," she said, her voice quiet. "Every story I hear is a mirror, and I don't always like what I see reflected back." I didn't absolve her or rush to comfort her. I just listened, and sometimes that was the most honest gift I could offer. Dad asked me about a foundation case, a young man in his 20s whose parents had opened credit cards in his name and destroyed his credit score before he'd even graduated college. For the first time in my memory, Dad was asking out of genuine interest rather than judgment, or the need to offer unsolicited advice. I explained the situation, and Dad was quiet for a moment before speaking. "Tell him not to wait as long as I did to admit he can't fix it alone," he said. "Tell him asking for help isn't weakness. It's the only way forward." It wasn't wisdom. It was hard-won humility earned through months of uncomfortable volunteer work and therapy and facing people whose pain mirrored the pain he'd caused. But it meant something, and I told him so. After dinner, Lila stayed to help me clean up, while our parents settled in the living room to watch football, a mundane and almost boring domestic scene that felt precious precisely because of its ordinariness. "Do you think we'll ever be like a normal family?" Lila asked as she handed me a dish to dry. I considered the question carefully. "I don't think we'll ever be normal, but we might become honest. And honestly, I'll take that." Later, after everyone had left and my apartment was quiet again, I stood in my bedroom looking at the framed photograph of Grandma May on my dresser, the same photo from her video will. Her face smiled out at me across the years, and I touched the ring on my right hand, feeling its familiar weight. "I did it, Grandma," I whispered into the empty room. "I didn't let them break me, and I didn't break them. I just built something better from what they left behind." In that moment, with no audience and no need for validation, I felt something I'd been chasing for 38 years: peace. Not happiness, which was too simple and too fleeting, but peace, the deep kind that comes from finally accepting that you can't control other people's choices, only your own response to them. The kind that arrives when you stop waiting for people to become who you need them to be and start becoming who you need yourself to be. I wasn't invited to my sister's wedding, but in the end, that rejection became the greatest gift I never knew I needed. Because it forced me to ask the question that changed everything. What if the people who are supposed to love you can't, but you're still worth loving anyway? I found my answer. And it wasn't in their apology, it was in the mirror. So that's my story. The wedding I wasn't invited to, the $60,000 bill that changed everything, and the grandmother who gave me permission to demand better. It took losing my place in my family to finally find my place in myself. And honestly, I'd make the same choice again. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. Stories like mine aren't easy to hear, and they're even harder to live through. But I'm sharing it because I know I'm not alone. Maybe you've been the family ATM too. Maybe you've been excluded and exploited at the same time. Maybe you're still trying to figure out if you're overreacting, or if what's happening to you is really as wrong as it feels. I'm here to tell you, trust your gut. You're not crazy, you're not selfish, and you deserve better. If this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments. Have you ever been asked to pay for something you weren't even invited to? How did you handle it? I read every comment, and your story matters just as much as mine. Let's build a community where we stop normalizing family dysfunction and start demanding accountability. See you in the next one.